She appeared at his door like a ghost from another life, a woman with fire in her eyes and a child clutching her skirts, standing between him and the emptiness that had consumed his world. "I was told you need a cook," she said, but Caleb Stone knew instantly she was running from something far darker than poverty. Behind her, the little girl's eyes held secrets that would either save them all or destroy everything he had left. What he didn't know was that in 3 weeks, a man would come to take that child away, and Caleb would have to choose between the safety of silence and the danger of love. If you want to see how far this story of courage, family, and second chances reaches, smash that like button and drop a comment with your city below. Now, let me take you back to a summer evening in 1879, when everything changed with a single knock on a weathered door. The sun was dying over Stone Creek Ranch, bleeding orange and crimson across the Montana sky like a wound that refused to heal. Caleb Stone stood at his kitchen window, hands braced against the counter, watching the light fade from another day he'd survived rather than lived. The house around him breathed with the kind of silence that had weight, the silence of empty rooms and unanswered questions, of meals eaten alone and conversations held only with ghosts. 3 years. 3 years since Sarah had been laid to rest on the hillside overlooking the creek, beneath the cottonwood where they'd carved their initials as young lovers who believed in forever. 3 years since this house had heard laughter or felt the warmth of purpose beyond the mechanical routines of survival. Caleb had become a man going through motions, performing the rituals of ranch life with the precision of a soldier following orders he no longer believed in. He was 34 years old and felt ancient. The kitchen reflected his state of mind, functional but hollow. Clean dishes sat stacked on shelves, not because he took pride in order, but because he used so few of them. The large oak table that had once hosted Sunday dinners and birthday celebrations now served as a desk for ranch paperwork and a resting place for saddles that needed mending. The stove, a beautiful cast iron piece Sarah had picked out from a catalog, sat cold more often than not. Why fire it up for one man who barely tasted his food anyway? Caleb ran a hand through dark hair that needed cutting, his fingers catching on tangles he couldn't be bothered to comb out properly. His reflection in the window glass showed a man who looked older than his years, jaw shadowed with several days of beard growth, eyes hollow with the kind of tired that sleep couldn't fix, shoulders that had forgotten how to fully straighten under the weight of grief that had set up permanent residence in his chest. The ranch still functioned because Caleb Stone was nothing if not stubborn. 1,400 acres of grazing land, 200 head of cattle, horses that needed training, fences that required constant mending, and the endless cycle of seasons that demanded a man keep moving or be buried under their weight. He had 2 ranch hands, Tom, an aging cowboy who'd known Caleb since he was a boy, and Miguel, a quiet man who asked no questions and expected nothing beyond fair pay and hard work. They were good men, loyal men, but they weren't what the ranch needed. They weren't what Caleb needed, though he'd spent 3 years pretending otherwise. "Boss?" Tom had approached him 2 weeks earlier, hat in weathered hands, looking uncomfortable in the way men do when they're about to speak truth. "We need to talk about the house." "What about it?" Caleb had responded, not looking up from the bridle he'd been repairing. "It's dying, Caleb, same as you are." Tom's directness was one of his most valuable and irritating qualities. You're eating beans from a can and jerky that's tougher than boot leather. You're wearing shirts with buttons missing and socks with holes. The place looks like a bachelor camp and you look like hell warmed over. "I'm managing fine." "You're not managing, you're existing. There's a difference." Tom had stepped closer, his voice dropping. "Sarah wouldn't want this." "You know she wouldn't." The mention of her name had sent a familiar spike of pain through Caleb's chest, sharp and fresh as the day they'd closed her coffin. "Don't talk about what Sarah would want. You don't know. I know she'd kick your ass from here to Sunday if she saw you living like this." Tom had stood his ground despite the dangerous edge in Caleb's voice. "Hire a cook, Caleb, someone to put real meals on that table and bring some life back into this house. For God's sake, do something before you disappear completely into this grief." Caleb had wanted to argue, to send Tom away with harsh words that would create enough distance to keep the truth from landing, but he was tired, so damn tired, of fighting battles that had no victory at the end. So he'd simply nodded, a single sharp dip of his chin, and said, "Fine, put word out in town. Someone who can cook and doesn't talk too much. I'll pay fair wages." Tom had looked surprised, but had the wisdom not to push his small victory. He'd ridden into Stone Creek the next day and spread the word that Caleb Stone needed a cook. Caleb had expected one of the widow women from town, or maybe one of the Mexican families that worked the neighboring ranches. Someone local, someone who understood ranch life, someone who wouldn't require explanation or demand anything beyond wages and a day off on Sundays. He hadn't expected the woman who appeared at his door as twilight settled over the ranch like a blanket. The knock came just as Caleb was contemplating whether to bother with supper or just go to bed and let another day die without ceremony. It was a firm knock, not tentative or apologetic, but not aggressive either. The knock of someone who expected to be heard but wouldn't be surprised by rejection. Caleb crossed the main room, his boots heavy on wooden floorboards that needed polish, and pulled open the door expecting Tom with a message, or Miguel with news of a broken fence or injured cattle. Instead, he found himself looking at a woman who seemed to have walked straight out of a harder world than most folks knew. She stood on his porch in a dress that had once been fine, but now showed the wear of too many washings and careful mendings. Dark brown hair was pulled back in a severe knot that revealed a face too thin, with cheekbones too sharp, and shadows under hazel eyes that spoke of too many sleepless nights. She was younger than him, maybe late 20s, but carried herself with the kind of weary determination that added years to any person. In her arms she held a large iron pot, cradled against her middle like it was precious cargo, and behind her, half hidden in the growing darkness, stood a child. "I was told you need a cook," the woman said without preamble, her voice clear and direct despite the exhaustion that lined her face. Her accent marked her as educated, maybe even from back east, which immediately raised questions in Caleb's mind about how she'd ended up on his remote ranch with darkness falling and a child in tow. Caleb's gaze moved from the woman to the little girl behind her. The child couldn't have been more than 6 or 7 years old, small for her age, with the same dark hair as the woman and eyes that watched Caleb with a mix of hope and wariness that struck something deep in his chest. She wore a dress that was clean but patched, and she held on to her mother's skirt with one small fist like it was the only anchor in a storm-tossed world. "You walked here?" Caleb asked, his mind calculating distances. The nearest town was 4 miles away, and there were no close neighbors in this direction. The road to his ranch was little more than a wagon track through rough country. "We did," the woman confirmed, lifting her chin slightly as if expecting judgment. "We're capable of work, Mr. Stone. We won't be a burden." The way she said "we" made it clear she wasn't asking for employment for herself alone. The child came as part of the package, non-negotiable. It was the kind of bold declaration that could go either way. Either he'd admire her directness, or send her packing for presuming too much. Caleb should have closed the door. He should have explained he'd expected someone from town, someone with references, someone who didn't bring complications in the form of a child who would require consideration and care. He should have offered to pay their way back to town tomorrow and wished them luck finding employment elsewhere. But the girl was looking up at him with those eyes that reminded him painfully of another child who'd never been born, the child Sarah had been carrying when the fever took her, and the woman's hands were shaking slightly as she held that pot, the tremor betraying nerves she was trying hard to hide. And Caleb realized with uncomfortable clarity that Tom had been right. He wasn't missing help. He was missing life. He was missing the sound of voices other than ranch hands discussing cattle and weather. He was missing the presence of people who saw this house as more than just a building, who might bring back some sense that it was a home worth maintaining instead of a mausoleum he was slowly being buried in. "You have a name?" he asked, his voice rougher than he'd intended. "Margaret Hale," she replied immediately. "This is my daughter, Lily." At the sound of her name, the child stepped slightly out from behind her mother's skirts, revealing more of herself to Caleb's scrutiny. She had freckles across her nose and a serious expression that seemed too old for such a young face. When she met Caleb's eyes, she didn't look away or hide, but studied him with the same careful assessment her mother had shown. "And you know how to cook?" Caleb asked, directing the question to Margaret, but watching both of them. "Yes, sir," Margaret said firmly. "I can cook, clean, mend, and manage a household. I can preserve food, tend a garden, And I'm not afraid of hard work. I'll earn my wages, Mr. Stone. You have my word on that. There was pride in her voice, the kind of pride that came from someone who'd lost much, but refused to lose herself in the process. Caleb recognized it because he'd heard the same tone in his own voice when he'd had to accept help in those first awful months after Sarah's death. The tone of someone who'd learned that accepting assistance wasn't the same as admitting defeat. You run from something. The question was blunt, but necessary. Caleb had learned long ago that people who showed up on remote ranches with night falling usually had reasons beyond simple employment needs. Margaret's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. A shadow of fear quickly controlled. We're looking for a fresh start, Mr. Stone. Nothing more complicated than that. I'm a widow. My husband died 2 years ago, and I've been making my way west since. We need stability. You need help. It seems a fair arrangement. It was a careful answer that didn't quite answer the question. But then, Caleb thought, everyone had their ghosts. He had no right to demand she spill hers when he kept his own locked so tight. The work's hard, he said, a final warning. Ranch life isn't easy. Early mornings, late nights. I run cattle, which means sometimes there's no fixed schedule, and winters here are brutal. We're not afraid of hard work, Margaret repeated, and this time her hand came down to rest on Lily's shoulder, a gesture both protective and reassuring. We just need a chance. Lily looked up at her mother, then back at Caleb. When she spoke, her voice was soft but clear in the evening quiet. Mama's a good cook, the best. She makes bread that tastes like sunshine. The unexpected poetry of it, bread that tastes like sunshine, said from such a serious little face, cracked something in Caleb's chest. He found himself almost smiling, the expression feeling strange on a face that had forgotten how. Bread that tastes like sunshine, he repeated, and Lily nodded solemnly, as if this was the most important qualification anyone could offer. Caleb stepped back, pulling the door wider. You'll stay tonight at least. There's a room off the kitchen that should work. We'll discuss terms in the morning when everyone's had rest and can think clearly. Relief flooded Margaret's face so quickly she couldn't hide it, though she tried. Thank you, Mr. Stone. You won't regret this. As she stepped past him into the house, Caleb wondered if that was true. He wondered what he was bringing into his carefully maintained isolation, what complications he was inviting past the threshold of his controlled grief. But then Lily followed her mother inside, and as she passed Caleb, she looked up at him and whispered, "Thank you for letting us stay," with such genuine gratitude that he felt ashamed of his hesitation. "Welcome to Stone Creek Ranch," he said quietly, closing the door against the night and wondering what the hell he'd just done. The room off the kitchen had been meant as a maid's quarters when Caleb and Sarah had built the house, full of hope and plans for a large family that would need help managing. It had never been used for its intended purpose. Sarah had insisted on doing her own housework, claiming she hadn't come west to sit idle while others did the living for her. Now the small room held only a narrow bed with a thin mattress, a chest of drawers with a cracked mirror above it, and a washstand with a chipped basin. Caleb lit the oil lamp on the stand and tried to see the space through Margaret's eyes. Sparse, yes, but clean and private, with a window that looked out toward the barn and mountains beyond. "It's not much," he said, suddenly aware of how little he had to offer. "It's perfect," Margaret said firmly, setting down her iron pot and the canvas bag that contained what Caleb assumed were all their worldly possessions. "Lily and I will be comfortable here." Lily had already moved to the window, pressing her small face against the glass to peer out at the darkened ranch yard. "Can I see the horses tomorrow?" she asked, her voice carrying the first note of childish excitement Caleb had heard from her. "Lily, don't presume," Margaret said quickly, but Caleb shook his head. "She can see the horses," he said. "Tom, he's one of the ranch hands. He'll be around in the morning. He's good with children. He'll show her around if that's all right with you." Margaret's expression softened slightly. "That's kind of you." "Kitchen's through there," Caleb continued, gesturing. "Help yourself to what you need. There's not much. I haven't kept the house well stocked, but there's coffee, flour, some bacon, and eggs. Tom usually brings by milk from town once a week." He paused, aware he was rambling and unsure how to extract himself from the situation gracefully. "I'll be up at dawn. Don't worry about breakfast for me. I usually just grab something quick and get out to work." What time is dawn? Lily asked, turning from the window. About 5:30 this time of year, Caleb answered. The child's eyes widened. That's very early. Lily, Margaret warned again, but Caleb found himself unexpectedly charmed by the girl's directness. It is early, he agreed. But cows don't care much about sleeping in. Do cows sleep standing up? Lily asked, moving closer with the kind of curiosity that all children carried before the world taught them to hold back their questions. Sometimes, Caleb said. They can anyway, though they usually lie down when they're really resting. How do you know if they're really sleeping or just pretending? Lily, Mr. Stone has work to do, Margaret interjected, placing a gentle hand on her daughter's shoulder. Let him get to his evening. We've imposed enough for one night. But Caleb found he didn't mind the child's questions. There was something refreshing about such straightforward curiosity, such innocent interest in the mundane details of ranch life he'd long since stopped noticing. Their ears, he said, answering Lily's question. When they're really sleeping, their ears relax and droop a bit. When they're just resting but alert, their ears stay up, listening for danger. Lily absorbed this information with serious attention, nodding as if he'd shared some profound wisdom. I'll watch for that tomorrow, she said. All right then, Caleb said, backing toward the door, suddenly needing distance from this strange domestic scene. I'll leave you to settle in. Good night, Mrs. Hale. Lily. Good night, Mr. Stone, Margaret said, and thank you again, truly. Caleb nodded and retreated, pulling the door closed behind him and standing for a moment in his own kitchen, trying to understand the feeling of displacement that had settled over him. The house already felt different, not better or worse, just different. There were sounds where there had been silence, the murmur of Margaret's voice as she spoke quietly to her daughter, the creak of bed ropes as someone sat down, the soft thump of that canvas bag being unpacked. People were living in his house again. He wasn't sure how he felt about that. Caleb made his way to his own bedroom, the room he'd once shared with Sarah, but that had become his alone, the room where he'd learned to sleep on one side of the bed because the other side was too painful to even look at, much less occupy. As he lay down in the darkness, still wearing most of his clothes because undressing felt like too much effort, he heard the faint sound of a child's voice through the walls. He couldn't make out the words, but the cadence was unmistakable. Lily asking more questions, probably, and Margaret answering with the patience of a woman who was used to her daughter's curiosity. It should have annoyed him. It should have felt like an invasion of the privacy he'd constructed so carefully around his grief. Instead, it made him realize just how silent his house had become, how silent his life had become. Maybe Tom had been right. Maybe he had been dying by inches, letting the silence swallow him piece by piece until there'd be nothing left but a bitter man going through the motions of life without ever actually living. Maybe these two strangers with their iron pot and canvas bag and questions about sleeping cows were exactly what Stone Creek Ranch needed. Or maybe Caleb was a fool, and by morning he'd regret every moment of weakness that had made him open that door, instead of sending them away. Time would tell. In the small room off the kitchen, Margaret Hale sat on the edge of the narrow bed and brushed her daughter's hair with long, gentle strokes, watching their reflection in the cracked mirror above the washstand. Do you think we can stay, Mama? Lily asked quietly, her voice small in the darkness. Margaret's hand paused mid-stroke. I don't know, sweetheart. We'll have to prove ourselves useful. Mr. Stone he's a man dealing with his own sorrows, I think. We'll need to be respectful of that. He looks sad, Lily observed with the blunt honesty of children. His eyes look like yours did when Papa first went away. The comparison made Margaret's chest tighten. She resumed brushing, needing the familiar motion to steady herself. Yes. Well, some people wear their grief on the outside. Mr. Stone seems to be one of them. But he was nice to me, Lily continued. He answered my questions even though you kept telling me to stop asking them. That's because you ask too many questions, Margaret said gently, but there was affection in her voice. Though you're right, he was kind to you. That speaks well of him. They were silent for a moment, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the house settling around them, the creak of old wood, the whisper of wind against the walls, the distant sound of cattle lowing in the night. Mama? Lily's voice was drowsy now, the exhaustion of their long journey finally catching up to her. Yes, love? I like it here. It feels safe. Margaret closed her eyes against the sudden sting of tears. Safe. Such a simple word, such an enormous need. They'd been running for so long, looking over their shoulders, jumping at shadows, never staying anywhere long enough to catch their breath. I hope so, Lily, she whispered, helping her daughter lie down and pulling the thin blanket up to her chin. I truly hope so. But even as she said it, Margaret's gaze drifted to the window, to the darkness beyond, and she couldn't quite silence the voice of fear that whispered this was too good to last, that safety was an illusion, that it was only a matter of time before the past caught up to them. She dealt with that fear when the moment came, she told herself firmly. For tonight, she'd let Lily believe they'd found sanctuary. For tonight, she'd let herself believe it too. Margaret lay down beside her daughter, fully clothed except for her boots, ready to run if necessary, but hoping desperately that running wouldn't be necessary this time. As sleep finally claimed her, her last conscious thought was of Caleb Stone's eyes, hollow with grief but not entirely dead. Not yet. There was still something alive in there, buried deep but fighting to survive. She understood that fight. She'd been fighting the same battle. Maybe that's why they'd ended up here. Two strangers united by loss, and the desperate need to believe that tomorrow could be different from yesterday. Maybe that's why she'd knocked on his door as darkness fell, carrying her iron pot like a talisman and her daughter like a prayer. Maybe that's why he'd opened it. Choi. Dawn came exactly at 5:30, announced by the crow of a rooster somewhere in the ranch yard and the soft golden light that crept through the small window of Margaret's room. She woke instantly, as she'd trained herself to do over the past 2 years, alert and aware before her eyes even opened fully, listening for danger before memory caught up to remind her where she was. Stone Creek Ranch. The widowed cowboy, the room off the kitchen. Safety, maybe. At least for today. Beside her, Lily still slept deeply, her small face peaceful in a way it so rarely was during waking hours. Margaret took a moment to study her daughter in the growing light, the dark fan of lashes against pale cheeks, the slight part of lips that still held the roundness of early childhood, the complete vulnerability of sleep. Everything Margaret did, she did for this child. Every choice, every sacrifice, every mile they'd traveled. Lily was the reason Margaret kept fighting when exhaustion threatened to swallow her whole. Moving carefully so as not to wake her daughter, Margaret rose from the bed and smoothed her dress as best she could. She needed to make herself presentable, needed to begin breakfast before Caleb Stone appeared, needed to prove immediately that hiring her hadn't been a mistake. The kitchen was empty when she entered, though it showed signs of recent use. A coffee cup in the sink, a knife on the counter beside breadcrumbs. Caleb had already been through, helping himself to whatever minimal breakfast he allowed himself before heading out to work. Margaret moved through the space with the practiced eye of someone who'd managed households before circumstances had ripped that life away from her. The kitchen was large and well-designed, clearly built by someone who'd envisioned it as the heart of a busy home. The cast-iron stove dominated one wall, a beautiful piece that must have cost considerable money. Good copper pots hung from hooks, though most showed signs of disuse. The pantry, when Margaret investigated, was indeed sparse. Flour, cornmeal, coffee, a few tins of beans, some salt pork that had seen better days. But there were also the bones of something more. Dried herbs hung from the ceiling beams, clearly long forgotten but still present. Glass jars lined shelves, empty now but waiting. A beautiful china service sat untouched in a cabinet, the kind of dishes a woman picked out carefully for the home she hoped to build. Sarah's kitchen, Margaret realized. The wife who'd died, leaving Caleb Stone alone in this big house with all these plans that would never come to fruition. The weight of another woman's dreams pressed down on Margaret's shoulders as she moved through the space, but she pushed the feeling aside. She wasn't here to compete with a ghost. She was here to survive, to give Lily stability, to earn honest wages through honest work. Still, she found herself speaking quietly to the empty room. "I'll take care of it," she promised the absent Sarah. "I'll take care of him, not the way you would have, I can't replace you, but I'll make sure he eats real food and has clean clothes and knows someone cares whether he lives or dies." The words hung in the morning air, then dissipated like smoke. Margaret set to work. The The bread dough she'd started the night before in her iron pot had risen perfectly. She shaped it quickly and set it to bake, then turned her attention to the eggs she'd found in the cold box and the bacon that needed rendering. Coffee went on to boil. Oatmeal started simmering with some dried apples she'd found in the pantry's back corner. By the time Lily emerged, rubbing sleep from her eyes and drawn by the smell of cooking food, the kitchen had transformed. The table was set with that beautiful china, food was hot and ready, and sunlight poured through windows Margaret had opened to let in the fresh morning air. "Oh, Mama," Lily breathed, her eyes wide. "It's like our old house." The comment struck Margaret's heart with unexpected force. Their old house, the home they'd had before everything fell apart, before Charles had died, before the truth about his debts and the people he'd crossed had come crashing down on them. "Sit down, sweetheart," Margaret said, her voice rougher than intended. "Eat something before Mr. Stone comes back. You'll need your strength if you're going to explore this ranch today." They ate together in comfortable silence, Lily making happy sounds over the fresh bread with butter and honey Margaret had discovered in the pantry. The child had inherited her mother's resilience. She could find joy in simple things, even after everything they'd been through. Margaret was just clearing the dishes when the back door opened and Caleb Stone stepped inside, followed by an older man she didn't recognize. Both men stopped short at the sight of the kitchen, their faces registering surprise at the transformation. Where there had been darkness and silence the night before, there was now light, warmth, and the smell of a real breakfast. "Jesus, Mary, and Joseph," the older man muttered, removing his hat. "When's the last time this place smelled like a home, Caleb?" Caleb's expression was harder to read. He stood in the doorway of his own kitchen looking almost uncertain, as if he'd walked into the wrong house by mistake. His gaze moved from the set table to the bread cooling on the counter to Margaret in her apron to Lily sitting at the table with honey on her chin, and something complicated passed across his face, too fast for Margaret to interpret, but painful enough to make her heart clench in sympathy. "Mrs. Hale," he said finally, his voice carefully neutral. "This is Tom Bradshaw, my foreman and oldest friend. Tom, this is Margaret Hale and her daughter Lily. She's the cook I told you I'd hire." Tom stepped forward with an easy smile, his weathered face creasing with genuine warmth. "Ma'am, little miss, welcome to Stone Creek. I hope this stubborn fool treated you decent last night." "Very decent," Margaret assured him, wiping her hands on her apron. "Mr. Stone has been nothing but kind. I hope we didn't presume too much. I took the liberty of making breakfast. There's plenty if you're hungry." "Hungry?" Tom laughed. "Ma'am, I'm always hungry. And if that's your bread I'm smelling, I may have to marry you myself just to keep eating it." "Tom," Caleb said warningly, but there was no real heat in it. Margaret felt herself relax slightly at Tom's easy manner. This was a man who understood how to make strangers feel welcome, who knew that humor could ease the awkwardness of new situations. "Sit down, both of you," she said with more confidence. "The food's getting cold." For just a moment, she thought Caleb might refuse, might retreat from this unexpected domesticity. But Tom was already moving toward the table, and Lily was watching them both with open curiosity, and refusing would have been more awkward than accepting. So Caleb sat at his own table, probably for the first time in months, Margaret suspected, and allowed her to serve him eggs and bacon and fresh bread with butter. The first bite seemed to surprise him. He chewed slowly, his expression shifting from wary to something like wonder. "This is," he started, then stopped, seeming unsure how to continue. "Good?" Tom supplied helpfully, already on his second piece of bread. "Damn good? The best thing you've eaten in 3 years?" "Tom," Caleb said again, but this time there was the faintest hint of amusement in his voice. "It's all right," Margaret said quickly. "I'm glad you like it. That's what I'm here for, to make sure you eat proper meals." "Are you going to show me the horses?" Lily asked Tom suddenly, her child's attention span unable to maintain interest in adult conversation about food. Tom's face lit up. "I sure am, little miss. Soon as we finish eating, I'll give you the grand tour. We've got horses, cattle, chickens, even a barn cat who just had kittens if you're interested." Lily's entire face transformed with delight. "Kittens?" "3 of them. Orange as sunsets and twice as pretty. You can help me name them if you want." As Tom and Lily fell into easy conversation about the ranch animals, Margaret felt the tension in her shoulders ease slightly. This was going to work. She could make this work. Lily would be safe here, would have space to be a child again instead of a small, frightened creature always looking over her shoulder. She glanced at Caleb and found him watching the interaction between Tom and her daughter with an expression that made Margaret's heart ache. Loss and longing mixed with something that might have been hope. All of it quickly shuddered when he realized she was looking at him. "You've done well," he said quietly, gesturing to the kitchen, the food, the general sense of order that had replaced chaos. "Better than I expected, truth be told." "I told you I could cook," Margaret replied, matching his quiet tone. "I meant it." "I can see that." He paused, then added, "The wages are $30 a month, plus room and board. Sundays off if you want them, though I understand if you need to work around Lily's schedule. Fair?" $30 a month was generous, more generous than Margaret had dared hope for. It was enough to start saving, enough to build some security for her and Lily, enough to maybe, finally, stop running. "More than fair," she said, hoping he couldn't hear the relief in her voice. "Thank you, Mr. Stone." He nodded once, then stood from the table, clearly uncomfortable with prolonged gratitude or sentiment. "Tom will show you around the house later, explain what needs doing. For now, just keep doing what you're doing. It's good. It's—" He stopped, searching for words. "It's been a long time since this place felt like anything other than a building I sleep in. So, thank you." And with that graceless but somehow touching acknowledgement, he grabbed his hat and headed back outside, leaving Margaret standing in the kitchen with a strange warmth spreading through her chest. "He's not good with words," Tom said kindly, having apparently been listening to the exchange. "But that right there? That was Caleb Stone saying you just gave him something he didn't know he needed. You done good, Mrs. Hale." Margaret nodded, not trusting herself to speak. She'd given Caleb something he needed, yes, but he'd given her something too. A chance. A place to stay. A reprieve from the constant fear that had been her companion for 2 long years. She just hoped it would last. She hoped they could stay hidden here long enough to build something resembling a life. She hoped the man looking for them would never think to search this far into the Montana wilderness. But hope, as Margaret had learned the hard way, was a dangerous thing to depend on. So instead, she focused on what she could control. This kitchen, this house, this job. She'd make herself indispensable. She'd prove her worth. She'd create a space where both she and Lily could begin to heal from the wounds the past had left on them. And if the past came calling, well, she'd face that when it happened. For now, she had bread to bake and a child to feed and a broken cowboy to gently, carefully bring back to life. It was enough. It had to be enough. The first week passed in a rhythm that felt almost like normalcy, if normalcy could exist in a house where 3 people circled each other like cautious animals learning to share territory. Margaret rose before dawn each morning, moving quietly through the kitchen while darkness still pressed against the windows. She learned Caleb's preferences without him having to voice them. Coffee strong enough to strip paint, eggs cooked until the yolks were just barely set, bacon crisp but not burned. She learned that he ate quickly, mechanically, as if fueling his body was a chore rather than a pleasure. She learned that he never took seconds, never lingered at the table, never made conversation unless directly addressed. But she also learned that he noticed things, the way his gaze would track to the fresh flowers she'd placed in a jar on the windowsill, the almost imperceptible pause when he walked into a kitchen that smelled like cinnamon and apples instead of emptiness and dust, the careful way he hung his coat on the hook by the door instead of throwing it over a chair, as if her presence had reminded him of standards he'd once held for himself. Lily bloomed under the attention of Tom and Miguel. The old foreman had taken to the child immediately, treating her with the gentle patience of a man who'd always wanted grandchildren but never had them. He showed her how to collect eggs without spooking the hens, how to identify different bird calls, how to braid rope and mend leather. Miguel, quieter but equally kind, taught her Spanish words for all the animals and let her help brush down the horses at day's end. The child's laughter began to echo through the ranch yard, a sound so foreign that the first time Caleb heard it, he stopped mid-stride and stood frozen, listening to something he'd forgotten could exist in his world. Margaret watched him from the kitchen window, her hands stilled in the dishwater, and wondered what memories that sound awakened in him, what lost futures it represented. what it cost him to hear joy in a place that had known so much sorrow. By the second week, patterns had solidified into routines. Margaret woke to find Caleb already gone, having slipped out in the pre-dawn darkness to check fences or move cattle or perform whatever mysterious tasks filled a rancher's endless days. She prepared breakfast for herself and Lily, packed a substantial lunch for all the men, then set about the work of reclaiming a house that had been neglected for too long. The main room first, she swept away cobwebs from corners, beat dust from curtains that hadn't been touched in years, polished wood until it gleamed. She found photograph albums tucked in a trunk, their pages filled with images of a younger Caleb and a beautiful woman with kind eyes and a warm smile. Sarah, the wife who haunted every corner of this house. Margaret studied those photographs with a mix of curiosity and guilt, feeling like an intruder into private grief. Sarah had been lovely, genuinely lovely, not just pretty, but radiating something that came through even in still images, intelligence and humor and a capable strength that Margaret recognized instantly. This was a woman who would have thrived on a ranch, who would have met challenges with grace and determination. This was a woman who'd chosen Caleb Stone and built dreams with him, dreams that now sat in boxes and gathered dust. "I'm not trying to replace you," Margaret whispered to the smiling face in the photographs. "I just need to survive. We both need to survive. Me and Lily. That's all this is." But even as she said it, she wondered if that was entirely true. Because there was something about Caleb Stone that called to the parts of herself she'd thought were dead. Not attraction exactly, though she couldn't deny he was a handsome man beneath the grief and the neglect. It was something deeper than that. A recognition of kindred damage. An understanding of what it meant to keep moving forward when everything inside you wanted to stop. She replaced the albums carefully, keeping her discoveries to herself. This wasn't her history to display or discuss. She was the hired help, nothing more, and she'd do well to remember that boundary. The house responded to her care like a living thing waking from hibernation. Colors brightened as she washed away layers of accumulated grime. Rooms that had felt like tombs began to breathe again. She found linens in a chest, beautiful things embroidered with care, and after washing and mending them, she put them to use. The house deserved to be lived in, not preserved like a museum to lost happiness. Caleb noticed. He didn't comment directly, but she caught him running his hand along a newly polished banister, pausing in doorways to study rooms that had been transformed, touching things with an expression that mixed pain with something that might have been gratitude. It was on a Thursday afternoon, nearly 3 weeks into her employment, that the careful distance they'd maintained finally cracked. Margaret was in the kitchen, arms deep in bread dough, when she heard the crash from outside, followed by a string of cursing that would have made a sailor blush. She rushed to the window and saw Caleb in the yard, favoring his left leg, blood streaming from a gash on his forearm, his face twisted in pain and fury. She didn't think. She simply moved. "Lily, stay inside," she commanded as she flew out the door, grabbing clean towels from the line as she passed. Caleb looked up at her approach, his expression darkening. "I'm fine. It's nothing." "It's not nothing. You're bleeding everywhere," Margaret said flatly, reaching for his arm. He tried to pull away, but she held firm with a strength born of necessity. "Hold still and let me see." "I said I'm fine, and I said hold still." Her voice carried an authority that surprised them both. "You can argue with me after I've determined you don't need a doctor. Until then, shut up and let me help you." For a moment, she thought he'd refuse. She could see the war playing out across his face, pride versus pain, independence versus need. But then his shoulders sagged slightly, and he allowed her to lead him to the porch steps. The cut was deep but clean, slicing across his forearm, where he'd apparently caught it on barbed wire. Margaret worked quickly and efficiently, cleaning the wound with water and whiskey, her hands steady despite the intimacy of touching him, of holding his arm across her lap while she worked. "This needs stitches," she said after examining it closely. "Just wrap it. It'll heal." "It'll heal wrong, and probably get infected. Don't be foolish." She looked up at him, their faces closer than they'd ever been. "I can do it if you'll let me. I've sewn up worse." His eyes, gray as storm clouds, studied her with new intensity. "Where did a woman like you learn to stitch wounds?" "A woman like me has learned to do a lot of things survival required," she replied evenly. Do you want my help or not? He held her gaze for a long moment, then nodded once. Do it. Margaret retrieved her sewing kit and a bottle of whiskey, returning to find Caleb exactly where she'd left him, staring out at his ranch with an expression of weary resignation. Drink, she said, offering him the bottle. I don't need drink anyway. This is going to hurt. He took the bottle, swallowed 3 long pulls, then handed it back. Get on with it. The first pierce of the needle made his jaw clench, muscle jumping beneath tanned skin, but he didn't flinch away. Margaret worked as quickly as she could, her stitches small and even, learned from necessity during the awful months after Charles died when doctors were a luxury they couldn't afford. You're good at this, Caleb said through gritted teeth. Practice I wish I'd never gotten. She tied off another stitch. My husband was accident-prone toward the end. I learned to patch him up when he'd come home in various states of damage. What happened to him? The question was direct, unadorned by social niceties or careful phrasing. Maybe the whiskey had loosened his tongue. Maybe the pain had stripped away his usual reserve. Either way, Margaret found herself answering with more honesty than she'd intended. He died owing money to men who don't forgive debts. I didn't know about any of it until they came looking for repayment and found only me and Lily. She pulled another stitch tight, maybe harder than necessary. So we ran. We've been running ever since. The silence that followed felt heavy with significance. Margaret kept her eyes on her work, afraid to look up, afraid of what she'd see in his face. Judgment? Pity? Disgust that he'd brought such trouble into his home? Is someone still looking for you? His voice was quiet, carefully neutral. I don't know, maybe. Probably. She tied off the last stitch and reached for bandaging. The debt was substantial. The men Charles crossed are the type who make examples of people. But it's been 2 years. Maybe they've given up. Maybe they've forgotten. Maybe you're fooling yourself, Caleb finished bluntly. Men like that don't forget. They don't forgive. If you owe them money, they'll keep looking until they find you or until they're dead themselves. Margaret's hands stilled in their wrapping. I know that. Don't think I don't know that. But what choice do I have? Keep running forever? Lily deserves more than a life lived in constant fear. She deserves stability, school, friends, a childhood that's more than just moving from place to place in the dark. So you came here. So I came here, Margaret confirmed, finishing the bandage and finally meeting his eyes. To the most remote place I could find, where maybe we could disappear long enough to catch our breath. I'm not asking you to protect us. I'm not asking you to fight our battles. I just need time. Time to figure out what comes next. Time to save enough money to maybe go further west. Time to... How much? What? How much does she owe? Caleb's gaze was intense, focused in a way she hadn't seen before. The debt. How much? Margaret laughed, a bitter sound without humor. $2,000. Might as well be $2 million for all my ability to pay it. Caleb was quiet for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he stood, testing his newly bandaged arm with careful movements. Thank you for the stitching. You did good work. Caleb. She'd never used his first name before, and it felt strange on her tongue. I shouldn't have told you all that. I'm sorry. If you want us to leave, I don't want you to leave. The words came out rough, almost angry. This house has been dead for 3 years. You and your daughter brought it back to life. I won't send you away because your dead husband made bad choices. He paused, then added quietly, We've all got ghosts, Margaret. Yours just happened to have a price tag attached. The use of her first name sent an unexpected warmth through her chest. They'd been Mr. Stone and Mrs. Hale for weeks, maintaining careful formality like a fence between them. This felt like crossing a line, stepping into territory that was both dangerous and oddly comforting. Thank you, she said softly, for understanding, for not judging. I'm not in a position to judge anyone, Caleb replied. Lord knows I've made enough mistakes of my own. He flexed his arm again, wincing slightly. You should get back inside. Lily will be wondering where you are. But neither of them moved. They stood on the porch in the afternoon sunlight, the space between them charged with something neither could quite name. Understanding, maybe. or recognition. The acknowledgement that they were both broken people trying to piece themselves back together with whatever materials they had at hand. "Caleb," Margaret ventured after a moment, "can I ask you something? Seems only fair given what you just told me. Why did you really hire me? Tom said you'd been refusing help for years. What changed?" He was quiet so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he sighed, the sound carrying the weight of 3 years of accumulated sorrow. "I looked at you standing in my doorway with your daughter behind you, and I saw—" He stopped, started again. "Sarah was pregnant when she died. Fever took them both, her and the baby we never got to meet. Would have been a girl," the doctor said. Margaret's breath caught. She'd suspected loss, but not this, not the double grief of wife and unborn child. "When I saw Lily," Caleb continued, his voice rough with emotion he wasn't quite managing to control, "I saw the daughter I never had, the life that could have been, and I thought, maybe having life in this house again would hurt less than the silence. Maybe hearing a child's voice would be better than the constant reminder of the voice I'd never hear." "And is it?" Margaret asked gently. "Better?" "I don't know yet," he admitted. "Some days it feels like salt in a wound that never healed right. Other days," he met her eyes, "other days I remember what hope felt like." The confession hung between them, raw and honest and more vulnerable than anything either had shared before. Margaret wanted to say something comforting, something wise, but all the words that came to mind felt inadequate to the moment. So instead she simply said, "Thank you for giving us a chance. Whatever your reasons, thank you." Caleb nodded, then turned toward the barn, clearly done with emotional revelation for one day. Margaret watched him go, this complicated man who'd opened his home to strangers because he saw in them echoes of his own lost dreams. She understood him better now, understood the careful distance he maintained, the walls he'd built around his grief, the way he seemed surprised by moments of joy, as if he'd forgotten he was allowed to feel them. They were the same, she and Caleb Stone, both running from ghosts, both trying to survive losses that had carved holes in their lives, both terrified that letting anyone close meant risking new pain when the inevitable loss came again. But here they were anyway, circling each other in this big house, slowly learning that maybe survival didn't have to mean isolation. Maybe healing could happen in the presence of someone who understood the weight of the scars you carried. Inside the house, Lily pressed her face against the window, watching her mother watch Caleb walk away. The child's young mind couldn't understand all the complicated feelings swirling between the adults, but she understood safety. She understood that here, on this ranch, with this sad cowboy and her strong mother, she felt less afraid than she had in 2 years. She understood that this place felt like it could become home if they were just brave enough to stay. The days continued to unfold, each one adding another thread to the fabric of their new life. Margaret discovered that Caleb was a man of patterns and routines, finding comfort in the predictability of ranch work. He rose before dawn, checked the cattle, mended fences, trained horses, and returned at sunset covered in dust and sweat and the honest exhaustion of physical labor. He ate the meals she prepared with what seemed like genuine appreciation, though he still rarely lingered afterward. He spoke little but listened carefully when others talked. He was patient with Lily when she bombarded him with questions, his answers thoughtful even when the questions were absurd. "Mr. Caleb," Lily had asked one evening at dinner, "if you could be any animal, which would you choose?" Tom had laughed at the child's imagination, but Caleb had considered the question seriously before answering. "A hawk, I think. Flying high enough to see everything, free to go wherever the wind takes you." "That's sad," Lily had pronounced with the blunt wisdom of children. "Hawks are always alone." The comment had struck something in Caleb's expression, a flicker of recognition and pain that he'd quickly hidden. But Margaret had seen it, and she'd understood. Yes, hawks were solitary, and yes, Caleb had chosen solitude after loss. But maybe, just maybe, he was beginning to remember that isolation wasn't the same as peace. The ranch itself responded to their presence. The vegetable garden that had gone to seed was cleared and replanted. The chicken coop was cleaned and repaired. Windows that had been dark for years now glowed with lamplight in the evenings. Laughter returned to a place that had forgotten the sound. Even the hands noticed the change. Miguel, who'd worked for Caleb for 2 years, mentioned quietly to Tom one afternoon that El Patron seemed different. Less like a man waiting to die and more like a man remembering why he'd wanted to live. Tom, who'd known Caleb since he was a boy, could only nod in agreement and thank whatever force had sent Margaret Hale to their door. But peace, as Margaret had learned, was always temporary. Happiness was always borrowed time before the bill came due. It was late on a Saturday afternoon, 5 weeks after Margaret and Lily's arrival, when the first crack appeared in their carefully constructed sanctuary. Margaret was in the garden, pulling weeds while Lily played nearby with one of the barn kittens, when she heard the sound of hoofbeats approaching on the main road. Visitors were rare this far from town, and her body tensed automatically, old instincts screaming danger. A man rode into view, well-dressed in a suit too fine for ranch country, riding a horse that spoke of money and careful breeding. He was perhaps 40, with dark hair silvering at the temples, and a face that might have been handsome if not for the coldness in his eyes. Margaret's blood turned to ice. She knew that look. She'd seen it before in the faces of the men who'd come looking for Charles's debts. The look of someone who saw people as commodities, problems to be solved, obstacles to be removed. "Lily," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the fear racing through her veins. "Go inside. Find Mr. Caleb or Tom. Do it now." "But Mama, now, Lily. Go." The child heard something in her mother's tone that brooked no argument. She scooped up the kitten and ran toward the barn where Tom was working, her small legs pumping with the urgency of instinct. Margaret stood slowly, wiping dirt from her hands, positioning herself between the approaching stranger and the path Lily had taken. Every muscle in her body was coiled tight, ready to fight or flee or do whatever necessary to protect her child. The man reined in his horse, looking down at Margaret with an expression that managed to be both polite and predatory. "Good afternoon. I'm looking for Mrs. Margaret Hale. I was told I might find her at Stone Creek Ranch." Every word was precisely spoken, cultured, educated, dangerous. "I'm Margaret Hale," she said, lifting her chin. "And you are?" "My name is Richard Thornton. I'm an attorney from Boston." He dismounted with practiced grace, brushing dust from his expensive coat. "I've been looking for you for quite some time, Mrs. Hale. You're a difficult woman to track." "Perhaps that should tell you something about my desire to be found, Mr. Thornton." Margaret's voice was cold, controlled. "State your business and leave." "My business is simple." Thornton smiled, the expression not reaching his eyes. "I represent certain parties in Boston who have a vested interest in the welfare of your daughter, Lily Hale. They've asked me to locate the child and ensure she's being properly cared for." Margaret's heart was hammering so hard she was certain he could hear it. "Lily is my daughter. She's being perfectly well cared for. Whatever your clients told you is a lie." "Is it?" Thornton's tone remained pleasant, conversational, which somehow made it more threatening. "I have documents here that suggest otherwise. Documents that indicate your late husband had certain arrangements in place regarding the child should anything happen to him and should you prove unable to provide appropriate care. That's impossible. Charles never told you," Thornton finished. "I'm afraid your late husband kept many secrets, Mrs. Hale. The debts you know about are merely the beginning. He borrowed extensively from my clients, and when he couldn't repay, he offered something else as collateral. He offered his daughter." The words hit Margaret like physical blows. "You're lying." "I have the papers to prove otherwise. Signed, witnessed, legally binding. Your husband wagered his daughter's future on business ventures that failed spectacularly. Now my clients are here to collect what they're owed. No one owns my child. No piece of paper gives anyone the right to take her from me." "The law might say differently, Mrs. Hale." Thornton reached into his coat, pulling out a thick envelope. "I have documentation of your husband's debts, his agreements, and testimony from several witnesses regarding your, shall we say, unstable lifestyle over the past 2 years. Constant moving, no permanent residence, no proper schooling for the child. A judge might very well determine that Lily would be better off in the care of a stable, wealthy family who can provide for her future." Margaret's vision blurred with rage and fear. "What you have is a pile of lies and forgeries designed to steal a child from her mother. I won't let it happen. Get off this property before I have you removed by force." "This property?" Thornton looked around with exaggerated interest. You mean this ranch that you've been working at for less than 2 months? Hardly a stable environment for a child, wouldn't you say? And what happens when your employer realizes what kind of trouble you've brought to his door? How quickly will he throw you out when he understands that harboring you could bring legal consequences? The only consequence you'll face is from me if you don't leave. Now. The new voice came from behind Margaret, low and dangerous. She turned to see Caleb approaching, Tom and Miguel flanking him, all three men wearing expressions that made clear they'd heard enough of the conversation to understand the threat. Thornton's smile widened, unbothered by the display of force. Ah, you must be Mr. Stone, the owner of this charming establishment. I apologize for the disruption, but I'm here on legal business regarding Mrs. Hale and her daughter. I heard your legal business, Caleb said flatly. Sounded more like extortion and lies to me. So I'll say it once more clearly. Get off my land. Mr. Stone, I understand you want to protect your employee, but she's not just my employee. She's under my protection. The child is under my protection. And I don't take kindly to threats against people under my protection. Caleb moved to stand beside Margaret, his presence solid and reassuring. Whatever papers you have are worthless out here. We do things differently in Montana. We protect our own. How noble, Thornton said dryly. But protection won't matter when the law arrives. I'll be back with a federal marshal and a court order. And when I return, I'll be taking the child into custody, whether you approve or not. He swung back into his saddle with fluid ease. You have 1 week to make your peace with it. After that, resistance will only make things harder for everyone involved. He turned his horse and rode away at a leisurely pace, confident and unhurried, a man who believed the law was on his side. Margaret's legs gave out the moment he was out of sight. She would have fallen if Caleb hadn't caught her, his strong hand steadying her as she gasped for breath against the panic threatening to overwhelm her completely. He can't, she managed to say through chattering teeth. He can't take her. She's all I have. She's everything. He won't, Caleb said firmly. I promise you, Margaret, he won't take that child. But even as he said it, Margaret saw the worry in his eyes, because they all knew the truth. The law was a powerful weapon in the hands of men with money and connections. And they were just simple people on a remote ranch, with no influence and limited resources. How did you fight power when you had none yourself? How did you protect the innocent when the system itself was corrupt? Margaret didn't have answers. All she had was the fierce primal determination of a mother who would die before letting anyone take her child. And as she looked into Caleb Stone's eyes, she saw that same determination reflected back at her. Whatever was coming, they would face it together. The battle for Lily's future had just begun, and surrender was not an option either of them would ever consider. That night, sleep was impossible. Margaret sat in the rocking chair beside Lily's bed, watching her daughter's peaceful face in the moonlight streaming through the window, memorizing every detail as if this might be the last time she'd have the chance. The curve of those small cheeks, the dark lashes fanned against pale skin, the slight part of lips that trembled with each breath. Every mother's instinct in her body screamed that danger was coming, and this time there might be no escape. Lily stirred, sensing her mother's presence even in sleep, and Margaret reached out to smooth the child's hair with trembling fingers. I won't let them take you, she whispered into the darkness. I don't care what papers they have or what lies they tell. You're mine, and I will burn the world down before I let them steal you from me. The words were a vow, a prayer to whatever force governed the universe, a promise written in her bones and sealed with every drop of blood in her veins. A soft knock on the door made her turn. Caleb stood in the doorway, still fully dressed despite the late hour, his face shadowed but his presence somehow steadying. Can't sleep either? He asked quietly. Margaret shook her head. Every time I close my eyes, I see him taking her. I see her crying for me while strangers carry her away to some house in Boston, where she'll be raised by people who bought her like property. Caleb stepped into the room, moving carefully so as not to wake Lily. That's not going to happen. You can't promise that. You heard what he said. He has papers, witnesses, legal authority. What do we have? Nothing but our word against his. We have the truth. Caleb's voice was low but firm. And we have something he doesn't expect. We have people who'll fight for that child because it's right, not because there's money in it. Margaret wanted to believe him. She wanted to have faith that truth and righteousness could stand against wealth and corruption. But she'd learned the hard way that the world didn't work that way. The powerful made the rules, and people like her simply tried to survive within them. "Tell me about Charles," Caleb said, settling into the chair across from her. "Tell me what really happened." The request surprised her. In the weeks she'd been here, they'd maintained careful boundaries around their pasts, sharing only what was necessary and leaving the painful details buried. But tonight, with threat hanging over them like a gathering storm, those boundaries felt less important than understanding. So Margaret told him. She told him about meeting Charles Hale when she was 22, a teacher in a small school in Philadelphia. He'd been charming, educated, full of grand plans and bigger promises. He'd courted her with poetry and passion, painting pictures of a life filled with adventure and security. She'd believed him because she'd wanted to believe, because loneliness made you vulnerable to beautiful lies. The first year of marriage had been good. Charles worked as an accountant for a shipping company. They'd had a small but comfortable home. And when Lily was born, Margaret had felt her life was complete. She had a family. She had purpose. She had everything she'd ever wanted. But then Charles had started coming home late, smelling of whiskey and cigars, making excuses that grew increasingly elaborate and decreasingly believable. Money became tight. He became secretive, irritable, prone to disappearing for days at a time with explanations that made no sense. "I knew something was wrong," Margaret said, her voice barely above a whisper, so as not to wake Lily. "I confronted him repeatedly, but he always had an answer, always had a reason why I was worrying over nothing. He made me feel foolish for questioning him, made me doubt my own instincts. The night Charles died, he'd come home in a panic, bleeding from a wound he wouldn't explain, shoving papers into a satchel and telling Margaret to pack essentials because they needed to leave immediately. Before she could demand answers, men had burst through their door, rough men with violence in their eyes and demands for money Charles didn't have. There'd been a fight. Shouting, crashes, Lily crying in Margaret's arms while she tried to shield her daughter from seeing things no child should witness. And then Charles had been on the floor, blood spreading beneath him, his eyes going distant while he gasped out his final words. "He told me to run," Margaret continued, tears streaming down her face now, the memories as fresh as if they'd happened yesterday instead of 2 years ago. "He said he'd borrowed money from the wrong people, that he'd gambled it away trying to win enough to pay off earlier debts. He said they'd come for me, for Lily, to collect what he owed. His last words were, 'Protect our daughter.' And then he was gone, and those men were looking at me like I was the solution to their problem." She'd grabbed Lily and run, leaving behind everything they'd owned except what she could carry. For 2 years they'd moved constantly, Philadelphia to Pittsburgh, to Cleveland, to Chicago, to St. Louis, always one step ahead of the men hunting them, always looking over their shoulders, never staying anywhere long enough to feel safe. "I thought we'd finally gotten far enough," Margaret said bitterly. "I thought Montana was remote enough, hidden enough. I thought I could give Lily a real home here, a real childhood. I was a fool." "You were a mother trying to protect her child," Caleb corrected. "There's no shame in that, and you're not a fool for believing you deserved safety. But I brought danger to your door. Thornton knows we're here now. He'll be back with authorities, with documents that might be forged, but will look legitimate enough. How do we fight that? How do we prove those papers are lies when we have no resources, no connections, no power?" Caleb was quiet for a long moment, his gaze on Lily's sleeping form. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a determination Margaret hadn't heard before. "Tomorrow morning, I'm riding to Stone Creek. There's a man there, Augustus Fletcher. He was a lawyer back east before he came west for his health. He's mostly retired now, but he's the smartest legal mind in 3 territories. If anyone can find holes in Thornton's documents, it's him. Can we trust him? Fletcher's a good man. Known him for 10 years. He helped Sarah and me draw up our ranch papers, handled some disputes with neighboring ranchers. He's honest, which is more than you can say for most lawyers." Caleb leaned forward, his eyes intense in the moonlight. "But Margaret, I need you to understand something. Fighting this means exposure. It means people in town knowing your story, knowing about the debts and the running. It means standing up in front of a judge if it comes to that, and laying everything bare. Are you ready for that? Margaret's first instinct was to say no, to retreat into the protective shell of secrecy she'd maintained for 2 years. Exposure meant vulnerability. It meant judgment. It meant risking everything on the slim hope that the truth would matter more than carefully constructed lies. But then she looked at Lily, at the child she'd carried in her body and in her heart through every mile of their desperate flight, and she knew there was no choice. Hiding hadn't kept them safe. Running hadn't solved anything. If they were going to survive this, they'd have to stand and fight, consequences be damned. "I'm ready," she said firmly. "Whatever it takes, I'm ready. Lily deserves a mother who fights for her, not one who runs and hides." Caleb nodded, something like approval crossing his features. "Then we fight. Together. You're not alone in this anymore, Margaret. Whatever comes, you have people standing with you." The words cracked something open in Margaret's chest, some wall she'd built to protect herself from hoping, from trusting, from believing anyone would choose to stand beside her when things got hard. But here was Caleb Stone, this grieving widower who'd let them into his home and his life, promising to fight battles that weren't his own simply because it was right. "Why?" she whispered. "Why would you risk all this for us? We're nothing to you, just strangers who showed up at your door." Caleb's expression softened in a way she'd never seen before, grief and determination mixing with something that might have been affection. "You stopped being strangers the first morning you filled this house with the smell of fresh bread and made it feel like a home again. Lily stopped being just some child the first time she laughed in my yard and reminded me what joy sounds like. You're under my protection now. That means something out here. That means I don't let men like Thornton take what isn't theirs to take." He stood, moving toward the door, then paused and looked back. "Get some rest if you can. Tomorrow starts the real fight, and you'll need your strength. But know this, I don't lose what's mine. And somehow, in the past weeks, you and Lily became mine to protect. I won't fail you." After he left, Margaret sat in the darkness, processing everything that had been said and unsaid. She'd spent 2 years believing she had to face the world alone, that trusting anyone meant risking betrayal. But Caleb Stone was teaching her something different. He was showing her that strength didn't always mean isolation, that sometimes the bravest thing you could do was accept help when it was offered. She finally lay down beside Lily, pulling her daughter close, and whispered promises into the child's hair. Promises that they would stay together, that they would fight, that they would win because the alternative was unthinkable. Morning came too quickly, announced by the rooster and the gradual lightening of the sky from black to gray to the pale gold of dawn. Margaret rose and went through the motions of preparing breakfast, her hands performing familiar tasks while her mind raced through scenarios, each one more frightening than the last. Caleb appeared as the coffee finished brewing, already dressed for riding, his face set with purpose. "I'll be back by nightfall. Tom and Miguel will stay close to the house. Don't let Lily out of your sight. And if Thornton comes back before I return, you send Miguel for the sheriff. Don't engage with him alone." "The sheriff can be trusted?" Margaret asked, handing him a cup of coffee and a cloth-wrapped bundle of food for the journey. "Sheriff Morrison's a fair man. He won't let anyone take a child without proper cause, and he sure as hell won't appreciate some Boston lawyer trying to throw weight around in his territory." Caleb drained the coffee in 3 long swallows. "But Fletcher's our best chance. If those documents have weaknesses, he'll find them." After Caleb rode out, the ranch felt too quiet, too exposed. Margaret kept Lily inside despite the child's protests, finding tasks to keep them both occupied and away from windows. She baked bread she didn't need, mended clothes that weren't torn, cleaned surfaces that were already spotless. Anything to keep her hands busy and her mind from spiraling into panic. Tom checked on them hourly, his weathered face creased with concern. "Boss'll fix this," he assured Margaret during one visit. "He's got that look he used to get when facing down rustlers or dealing with difficult cattle buyers. Means he's in fighting mode, and Caleb Stone in fighting mode is something to see." "I hope you're right," Margaret said. "I hope determination is enough." Determination plus Fletcher's legal mind plus the fact that everyone in Stone Creek knows Caleb's an honorable man, that's more than enough, ma'am. You'll see. But as the day wore on and shadows lengthened, Margaret's anxiety only grew. She imagined Caleb being turned away by Fletcher, or worse, discovering that Thornton's documents were ironclad and legal. She imagined marshals arriving before Caleb returned, dragging Lily away while Margaret screamed and fought uselessly against overwhelming force. She imagined losing her daughter, and the thought made her physically ill. Lily sensed her mother's distress despite Margaret's attempts to hide it. The child stayed close, unusually quiet, her small hand finding Margaret's whenever possible. "Mama, are bad men coming?" she asked finally, her voice trembling. Margaret knelt down, taking her daughter's face in her hands. "Some people might try to cause trouble, sweetheart, but Mr. Caleb is working to stop them. And no matter what happens, I want you to remember something important. You are my daughter. Nothing anyone says or does can change that. You belong with me, and I will fight with everything I have to keep us together. Do you understand?" Lily nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "I don't want to go away from you." "You won't. I promise you, baby, you won't." Margaret pulled her daughter into a fierce embrace, silently adding all the things she couldn't say aloud. That she'd kill anyone who tried to take this child, that she'd run again if necessary, harder and farther than before. That there was no law, no document, no threat in the world that could make her willingly surrender her daughter. The sun was setting when they finally heard hoofbeats approaching. Margaret's heart leapt into her throat, her body tensing for flight or fight. But then she saw it was Caleb returning, and beside him rode an older man with white hair and sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles. Fletcher. It had to be Fletcher. Margaret met them at the door, trying to read Caleb's expression for clues about what he'd learned. His face was carefully neutral, giving nothing away, which somehow made her more nervous. "Mrs. Hale," the older man said, dismounting with the stiffness of age. "I'm Augustus Fletcher. Caleb's told me about your situation. Might we come inside and discuss it properly?" They settled in the main room, Lily sent to her room despite her protests, while Fletcher spread papers across the table. Notes he'd made during his conversation with Caleb, references to territorial law, precedents from cases he remembered. "First things first," Fletcher said, his voice calm and professional. "Tell me everything about these men your husband owed money to. Names, if you know them, what they look like, anything Charles might have said about them." Margaret recounted what she knew, which felt painfully inadequate. Charles had been secretive, paranoid. He'd mentioned names in his final moments: Sullivan, Brennan, people involved in gambling and worse, but nothing concrete enough to trace. Fletcher nodded, making notes. "And this Thornton, describe him precisely. His appearance, his manner of speaking, any details you remember." Margaret did her best, painting a picture of the well-dressed attorney with cold eyes and cultured voice. Fletcher's expression grew increasingly interested as she spoke. "Tell me," he said when she finished, "did Thornton show you these supposed documents? Let you examine them?" "No, he just claimed to have them, said they were signed and witnessed." "Interesting." Fletcher tapped his pen against his notes. "Because if the documents were legitimate, he would have served you with them immediately. The fact that he merely threatened their existence suggests they might not be as ironclad as he wants you to believe." Hope flickered in Margaret's chest. "You think they're forgeries?" "I think it's possible. Men like Thornton operate in gray areas, using intimidation and the appearance of legal authority to get what they want, but appearance isn't the same as reality." Fletcher leaned back, studying Margaret with sharp eyes that missed nothing. "However, we need to consider another possibility. What if the documents are real? What if Charles did, in his desperation, sign away some claim to his daughter?" The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. "He wouldn't. He loved Lily." "Desperate men do desperate things," Fletcher said gently. "I'm not saying he did it willingly or with full understanding of what he was signing. Loan sharks are experts at burying important clauses in complex documents, but we need to prepare for all possibilities." "So what do we do?" Caleb asked, speaking for the first time since they'd sat down. "How do we fight this?" Fletcher was quiet for a moment, organizing his thoughts. "First, we demand to see the actual documents. Under territorial law, no child can be removed from a parent's custody without proper legal proceedings. That means Thornton needs to present his evidence before a judge. We'll force him to do exactly that." "And if a judge sides with him?" Margaret's voice was barely steady. "Then we appeal. We fight. We bring character witnesses who can testify to your fitness as a mother and the child's well-being in your care. We challenge every aspect of those documents, the signatures, the witnesses, the circumstances under which they were allegedly signed. We make it expensive and difficult and public enough that Thornton's clients might decide it's not worth the trouble. Fletcher's gaze moved between Margaret and Caleb, something calculating in his expression. There is one other option, though it's unconventional. If Lily were legally adopted by someone with standing in the community, someone whose custody couldn't be questioned, those documents, real or forged, would become irrelevant. Charles Hale could only sign away his own parental rights, not those of a legal guardian appointed after his death. Understanding dawned slowly, and Margaret felt her face flush. "You mean—" "I mean that if Caleb Stone were to legally adopt Lily as his daughter, or if you and Caleb were to marry, establishing him as the child's legal stepfather, Thornton's claims would have no basis. The child would be under the protection of a respected rancher and territorial citizen. Try as he might, Thornton couldn't overcome that." The room fell into shocked silence. Margaret couldn't look at Caleb, couldn't breathe, couldn't process what Fletcher was suggesting. Marriage, adoption, legal ties that went far beyond hiring her as a cook. "That's asking too much," she finally managed to say. "Mr. Stone has already done more than enough. We can't expect him to legally bind himself to our problems." "You're not asking," Fletcher pointed out. "I'm suggesting, as a legal strategy." "It's still too much." "Is it?" Fletcher's voice was gentle but challenging. "What's too much when a child's future is at stake? What wouldn't you do to keep your daughter safe?" "Anything," Margaret whispered. "I'd do anything, but I can't ask someone else to sacrifice their freedom for our sake." "Then it's fortunate you're not asking." Caleb's voice cut through the tension, firm and decided. "Fletcher's right. If adoption or marriage would protect Lily, then that's what we'll do." Margaret's head snapped up, meeting his eyes across the table. "Caleb, you can't possibly—" "I can, and I am." His expression was set, immovable. "This ranch needs a woman's touch. Lily needs a father. You need protection. Seems like a solution that works for everyone." "But you don't love me." The words came out before Margaret could stop them, raw and honest and slightly desperate. Something shifted in Caleb's eyes, some emotion too complex to name. "Love is a luxury, Margaret. Sarah and I had love, and it was beautiful, and then it was gone. What we have here is something different: mutual respect, shared purpose, a need to protect a child from people who'd use her as property. That's worth more than romance, in my opinion. That's something real." Fletcher cleared his throat, drawing their attention back to practical matters. "Before we pursue either option, let me do some investigating. I have contacts in Boston, other lawyers who might know Thornton's reputation. If he's known for this type of scheme, that information could be valuable. Give me a few days. In the meantime, don't let Lily out of your sight, and document everything: her health, her happiness, her education. If this goes before a judge, we want to prove beyond doubt that she's thriving in your care." After Fletcher left, promising to send word as soon as he learned anything useful, Margaret and Caleb remained at the table, the weight of the conversation settling over them like snow. "You're serious," Margaret said finally, "about the marriage option." "I'm serious about protecting that child. If marriage does that, then yes, I'm serious." Caleb stood, moving to the window that overlooked his land. "I told you before. You and Lily brought life back to this house. You gave me something to care about beyond just surviving day to day. Maybe that's not love in the romantic sense, but it's something. It's enough." Margaret joined him at the window, studying his profile in the fading light. This man who'd opened his home to strangers, who'd promised to fight battles that weren't his own, who was now offering to legally bind himself to a woman and child he'd known for barely 2 months, all because it was the right thing to do. "What about Sarah?" she asked quietly. "Would she want this? You binding yourself to someone else, to a ready-made family, to complications that have nothing to do with the life you built with her?" Caleb was silent for a long moment. "Sarah would want me to live," he said finally. "She'd want this house filled with laughter instead of ghosts. She'd want me to find purpose again. And she'd definitely want an innocent child protected from men who'd treat her like property." He turned to face Margaret fully. This isn't about replacing Sarah or forgetting what we had. This is about honoring her memory by being the kind of man she believed I was. The kind who stands up for what's right, no matter the personal cost. Tears stung Margaret's eyes. I don't deserve your kindness. Kindness has nothing to do with it. This is justice. This is refusing to let evil men win because they have money and we don't. His hand found hers, squeezing gently. We're in this together now, Margaret. Whatever comes, we face it as a united front. Whether that means marriage or adoption or just standing side by side in court, we don't let them break us. Agreed? Margaret nodded, unable to speak past the emotion clogging her throat. For 2 years, she'd believed she had to fight alone, had to protect Lily through her own strength and cunning. But here was Caleb Stone, offering to share the burden, to stand as a shield between her daughter and the darkness pursuing them. Agreed, she finally managed. Together. They stood there as night fell completely, hands clasped, both staring out at the ranch that had somehow become a battleground. Neither of them knew what the next days would bring. Neither could predict whether Fletcher would find ammunition for their fight or whether Thornton would return with overwhelming force. But they knew one thing with certainty. They wouldn't surrender. They wouldn't let fear dictate their choices. They would fight for Lily with everything they had, consequences be damned. In her room, Lily pressed her ear against the door, listening to the murmur of adult voices discussing her future. She didn't understand all the words, couldn't grasp all the complexities, but she understood the important part. Mr. Caleb was trying to keep her safe. Mama was fighting to keep them together. And somehow, in the midst of all this fear and uncertainty, the three of them were becoming something like a family. It wasn't what Lily had imagined family would be. There was no real father, no traditional happiness, no simple happily ever after. But there was fierce devotion. There was determination to protect each other. There was a willingness to sacrifice personal comfort for collective safety. Maybe that was what family really meant. Not blood or law or conventional arrangements, but choosing to stand together when the world tried to tear you apart. Lily climbed into bed and closed her eyes, holding tight to that thought like a talisman against the darkness. Whatever came next, they would face it together. Mr. Caleb had promised, and Mama had agreed, and Lily trusted them both with the absolute faith that only children possess. They would be okay. They had to be okay. Because the alternative was too terrible to imagine, and Lily had learned that sometimes the only way to survive fear was to refuse to let it win. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. But tonight, in this house that had become their sanctuary, 3 people bound together by circumstance and choice would rest and gather strength for the battle ahead. The fight for Lily's future was just beginning, and surrender had never been an option any of them would consider. 3 days passed in tense anticipation, each hour stretching like pulled taffy while they waited for word from Fletcher. Margaret threw herself into work with almost manic energy, scrubbing floors that didn't need scrubbing, reorganizing pantries that were already organized, baking enough bread to feed an army. Anything to keep her hands busy and her mind from spinning through worst-case scenarios. Caleb stayed closer to the house than usual, finding tasks that kept him within shouting distance. He repaired the porch railing that had been loose for months, replaced shingles on the barn roof, mended tack in the yard where he could see both doors. Tom and Miguel took turns keeping watch on the main road, ready to sound an alarm if Thornton or anyone else approached. Lily felt the tension like a physical presence, growing quieter each day, staying close to Margaret with an anxiety that broke her mother's heart. The child who'd begun to bloom in the safety of the ranch was retreating back into the frightened creature they'd been during their years of running. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, a rider appeared on the horizon. Not Fletcher, but a young man Margaret didn't recognize, carrying a leather satchel that marked him as a messenger. Her heart lurched into her throat as Caleb met him in the yard, accepting an envelope with grim determination. Fletcher sent word, Caleb said, returning to the house where Margaret waited with white-knuckled hands gripped together. He's found something, wants us to come to town tomorrow morning early, says it's important we meet before Thornton makes his next move. Did he say what he found? Margaret's voice came out thin, reedy with hope she was afraid to feel. No details in the message, just that we need to come, and we need to bring Lily. Caleb's expression was unreadable. He also says to bring any papers you have from your marriage to Charles. Anything that might prove dates or circumstances. Margaret's mind raced through their meager possessions. She had her marriage certificate, carefully preserved despite 2 years of running. She had Lily's birth certificate. She had a few letters Charles had written during a business trip early in their marriage, before everything fell apart. Not much, but perhaps enough. "We'll go," she said firmly. "All three of us. Whatever Fletcher's found, we face it together." That night, Margaret barely slept. She lay in the darkness, listening to Lily's breathing, trying to memorize the sound in case this was one of the last nights they'd share a room. The thought made her physically ill, but she forced herself to consider it. If tomorrow brought bad news, if Fletcher had discovered Thornton's documents were legitimate and unassailable, what would she do? Run again? Fight anyway? How far would she go to keep her daughter? The answer came swift and certain, as far as necessary. To the ends of the earth, beyond the bounds of law or reason. She was a mother, and mothers didn't calculate costs when their children's lives hung in the balance. Morning came gray and cold, autumn asserting itself with frost that painted the windows and breath that misted in the air. Margaret dressed carefully, choosing her best dress. The one she'd been married in, actually, altered and mended but still respectable. She wanted to look like a proper mother, a woman of substance, someone who deserved to keep her child. Lily wore her Sunday dress, the blue one with lace at the collar that Margaret had sewn herself. The child's face was pale, her eyes too large, but she held herself with a dignity that made Margaret's heart swell with fierce pride. Whatever else Charles had been, whatever mistakes he'd made, he'd given Margaret this extraordinary child. That counted for something. Caleb appeared dressed in clothes Margaret had rarely seen him wear. A proper suit, dark and well-tailored, his hair neatly combed and face freshly shaved. He looked like a different man, transformed from weathered rancher to respectable gentleman. The effect was striking, and Margaret felt an unexpected flutter in her chest that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the realization that Caleb Stone was an uncommonly handsome man when he made the effort. "Ready?" he asked, and Margaret nodded, taking Lily's hand and following him to the wagon he'd prepared. The ride to Stone Creek took just under an hour, the three of them silent with anticipation. Lily sat between Margaret and Caleb on the wagon seat, small and vulnerable, occasionally reaching out to touch first her mother's arm, then Caleb's, as if reassuring herself they were both still there. The town appeared gradually, buildings emerging from the morning mist like ships materializing from fog. Stone Creek was modest but prosperous, the kind of frontier community that had survived its wild early days and settled into something resembling civilization. The main street boasted a general store, a hotel, a saloon that had been converted to a respectable restaurant, a church, and at the far end, a small building that served as both courthouse and town hall. Fletcher's office occupied the second floor above the general store, accessible by an external staircase. The lawyer himself met them at the door, his expression grave but not without hope. That small spark of optimism in his eyes gave Margaret the courage to climb the stairs on legs that wanted to collapse beneath her. Inside, the office was cramped but organized, every surface covered with law books and papers and the accumulated tools of a man who'd spent his life navigating the complexities of justice. Fletcher gestured them to chairs arranged before his desk, then settled himself with the deliberate movements of someone about to deliver news that required careful handling. "First, let me say that I've learned quite a bit about your Mr. Thornton," Fletcher began, pulling a folder from his desk. "Richard Thornton is indeed a lawyer, licensed in Massachusetts, with a practice that specializes in what he calls debt recovery and asset reclamation. What that actually means is he finds creative ways to extract value from people who owe money to certain unsavory individuals." "So he does work for loan sharks," Margaret said. "In essence, yes, though he operates within legal boundaries, or appears to, which makes him more dangerous than simple thugs." Fletcher opened the folder, revealing pages of notes. "I contacted an old colleague in Boston who was able to investigate Thornton's recent activities. It seems your husband did indeed borrow a substantial sum from men connected to organized gambling operations. $2,000, as you suspected." Margaret's heart sank. So the debt was real. That meant everything else might be real too. "However," Fletcher continued, his tone sharpening, "there is no record of any agreement involving your daughter, No documents filed with any court, no witnesses who can be located, no evidence whatsoever that Charles Hale signed over any rights to his child as collateral for the loan. Hope surged so suddenly, Margaret felt dizzy. So Thornton's lying? About the documents, almost certainly. What he likely has is the original loan agreement, which is legitimate, and perhaps some fabricated addendum that he hopes to use to intimidate you into surrendering the child without legal challenge. Fletcher leaned forward. His pattern is well established. He threatens legal action, waves official-looking papers, relies on people being too poor or too frightened to fight back. Most of his targets simply comply, believing they have no choice. But we have a choice, Caleb said, his voice hard. You do. We demand he present his evidence before a territorial judge. We challenge every document, every signature, every claim. And we have something he doesn't expect. We have you, Mr. Stone, willing to serve as guardian and protector. That changes everything. Fletcher pulled out another set of papers, these ones fresh and clearly prepared specifically for this meeting. I took the liberty of drawing up 2 sets of documents. The first is an adoption petition, which would make Lily legally your daughter, Mr. Stone, with Mrs. Hale's consent. The second is a marriage license and a petition naming you as legal stepfather upon marriage. Either would effectively nullify any claim Thornton might fabricate, because Charles Hale's alleged agreements would become irrelevant once parental authority transfers to someone else. Margaret stared at the papers, her mind struggling to process. You want us to decide right now? Today? I want you to be prepared. Thornton will return, probably within the next few days. When he does, we need to present him with facts that make pursuing this case more trouble than it's worth. If Lily is legally under Mr. Stone's protection, Thornton's clients lose their leverage. The debt dies with Charles, as it legally should have from the beginning. Caleb reached across and took the papers, studying them with careful attention. Margaret watched his face, trying to read his thoughts, wondering if he was having second thoughts about the enormous commitment he'd offered so readily. But when he looked up, his expression was resolute. Which option is stronger legally? Marriage, Fletcher said without hesitation. Adoption can be challenged, claiming the mother was coerced or incompetent. But a legitimate marriage between 2 adults creates a family unit that's much harder to attack. You become Lily's stepfather with full parental authority. Mrs. Hale remains her mother. The child has 2 legal guardians instead of 1. Thornton would need to prove both of you unfit, which would be nearly impossible given your standing in the community, Mr. Stone. Margaret felt the walls closing in, her breath coming short. This was happening too fast, racing toward a decision that would bind her to a man she barely knew, that would transform her entire life in ways she couldn't predict. Yes, Caleb was kind. Yes, he'd shown himself to be honorable and protective. But marriage, legal, binding marriage. Margaret, Caleb's voice cut through her spiraling thoughts. Look at me. She forced her eyes to his, finding steadiness there that anchored her panic. We don't have to do this, he said quietly. If you're not comfortable with marriage, we try the adoption route. If you'd rather fight without these legal protections, we do that. This is your choice. I'm offering options, not demands. But Fletcher said marriage is the stronger option, Margaret whispered. Stronger doesn't matter if you can't live with it. I won't force you into something that makes you feel trapped. Caleb's hand found hers, warm and solid. We've built something these past weeks, trust, respect, maybe even friendship. That's worth preserving no matter what we decide about the law. The kindness in his words made Margaret want to cry. Here was a man offering her the ultimate protection while simultaneously giving her freedom to refuse it. A man who understood that legal safety meant nothing if it came at the cost of personal agency. She looked at Lily, who sat quietly listening to adult conversations about her future. Her daughter, her reason for everything, the child she'd die to protect. What wouldn't she sacrifice for this girl? What price was too high? If we married, Margaret said slowly, directing her words to Fletcher but her eyes still on Lily, would it be real, legally binding and recognized? Completely. I can perform the ceremony myself. I'm authorized by the territory. We'd need 2 witnesses, which I can provide. You'd be husband and wife in every legal sense. But not in the personal sense, Margaret clarified, finally looking at Caleb. We'd need to be clear about expectations. This would be a marriage of convenience, a legal protection, not a real marriage in terms of... She couldn't finish the sentence, her face flushing with embarrassment. We'd figure out the personal details as we went, Caleb said firmly. Separate rooms if you want them. No expectations beyond what we're both comfortable with. The marriage is real on paper, real in terms of protecting Lily. Everything else is negotiable between us. Fletcher cleared his throat delicately. I should mention that for the marriage to be unassailable legally, it should appear genuine. Living as husband and wife publicly, presenting a united front, demonstrating a legitimate family structure. What happens privately is your business, but outwardly, it needs to be convincing. Can we do that? Margaret asked Caleb. Can we pretend well enough to fool people who will be looking for reasons to tear this apart? Caleb's thumb traced across her knuckles, a gesture that was both comforting and intimate. I think we can do more than pretend. I think we can build something real. Maybe not romance, but partnership, respect, shared purpose. That's more than a lot of married couples have. He was right, Margaret realized. She'd seen marriages based on love crumble under pressure. She'd lived in one herself, watching Charles's charm give way to lies and weakness. But this thing she and Caleb were building was different. It was founded on honesty, on mutual need, on a clear-eyed understanding of what they could offer each other. Maybe that was stronger than romance. Maybe that was what would last when the pretty feelings faded. All right, Margaret said, her voice steadier than she felt. Let's do it. Let's get married. Lily's head snapped up, her eyes wide. You're marrying Mr. Caleb? He's going to be my papa? The hope and fear mixed in the child's voice nearly undid Margaret's composure. He'll be your stepfather, sweetheart, which means he'll help take care of us and protect us. Would you like that? Lily's answer was to launch herself at Caleb, wrapping small arms around his neck with desperate strength. Yes, I want that. I want you to be my papa. Caleb stiffened for just a moment. Then his arms came around the child, holding her with a gentleness that made Margaret's heart clench. She could see the emotions playing across his face. Surprise, tenderness, grief for the daughter he'd never had, determination to be worthy of this child's trust. Then that's what I'll be, he said roughly, his voice thick. Your papa, and I'll do my best to be a good one. Fletcher, practical man that he was, pulled out his pocket watch. If we're doing this, we should do it now. I can have the witnesses here within the hour. The license just needs signatures. You can be married by noon. Everything was moving so fast, but Margaret found herself nodding. Yes, now. Before she could overthink it, before fear could convince her to run again, before Thornton could return and destroy this fragile hope they were constructing. I'll need to step out for a few minutes, Fletcher said, standing. Make yourselves comfortable. Help yourselves to water from the pitcher there. I'll return shortly with witnesses and we'll proceed. After he left, the three of them sat in thick silence. Lily remained on Caleb's lap, playing with one of his collar buttons, comfortable in a way she'd never been with any man except her father. Margaret watched them together and felt something shift in her chest, some locked door beginning to open. Are you sure? She asked Caleb quietly. Truly sure? This is your last chance to back out without consequence. Caleb met her eyes over Lily's head. I'm sure. Are you? I'm terrified, Margaret admitted. But I'm sure. This is right. For Lily, for the protection she needs. Maybe even for us. Maybe even for us, Caleb agreed. Strange how life works, isn't it? 2 months ago, I was a man who'd given up on everything except surviving day to day. Now I'm about to become a husband again, and a father for the first time. If someone had told me that morning you knocked on my door that this is where we'd end up, I'd have called them crazy. Would you have opened the door if you'd known? He was quiet for a moment, considering. Yes, he finally said. Even knowing all the complications, all the danger, all the ways this could go wrong, yes, because you and Lily gave me something I'd lost. You gave me a reason to care about tomorrow. The simple honesty of it made Margaret's eyes sting with tears. She reached across and took his free hand, the one not supporting Lily, and squeezed. Then let's build that tomorrow together, as partners, as a family. As a family, Caleb agreed. Fletcher returned 45 minutes later with 2 witnesses, a middle-aged woman who ran the general store below, and a banker named Morrison who Caleb seemed to know well. They were both clearly curious about the sudden marriage, but too polite to ask probing questions. The ceremony itself was brief and businesslike, nothing like the romantic wedding Margaret had imagined as a young girl, or even the modest ceremony she'd had with Charles. Fletcher read the required words from a book, asking if they took each other as husband and wife. Margaret heard herself say, "I do," in a voice that sounded steadier than she felt. Caleb's "I do" was firm, decisive, leaving no room for doubt. "Do you have rings?" Fletcher asked. They didn't. Margaret hadn't even thought about rings. But Caleb reached into his pocket and pulled out a simple gold band. "This was Sarah's," he said quietly, holding it out to Margaret. "If you're comfortable wearing it." She would have wanted it to be used, not sitting in a drawer. Margaret took the ring with trembling fingers. It felt heavy, weighted with history and meaning. "Are you certain?" This was hers. "And now it's yours. Different marriage, different circumstances, but still a promise to build something together." She'd approve. Caleb's voice was gentle but sure. Margaret slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as if it had been made for her. She had nothing to give Caleb in return, but he shook his head when she started to apologize. "We'll figure out the details later. For now, this is enough." "Then by the power vested in me by Montana Territory," Fletcher intoned, "I pronounce you husband and wife. Mr. Stone, you may kiss your bride if you wish." Caleb leaned forward and pressed a chaste kiss to Margaret's forehead, a gesture that was more promise than passion. She found herself grateful for his restraint, for his understanding that this moment was complicated enough without adding physical expectation. The witnesses signed the certificate. Fletcher notarized it with official stamps and seals. And just like that, Margaret Hale became Margaret Stone, and Lily gained a stepfather, and Caleb Stone found himself responsible for two people who'd arrived at his door less than 2 months ago. "Congratulations," Fletcher said, genuine warmth in his voice. "Now, let's make sure this marriage does what it needs to do, protect your family from those who'd tear it apart." The rest of the day was spent in Fletcher's office, preparing for Thornton's inevitable return. They reviewed every legal angle, every potential argument, every piece of evidence that proved Lily was thriving in their care. Fletcher coached them on what to say, how to present themselves, how to make clear that this family would not be intimidated by threats or fraudulent documents. By the time they left Stone Creek in the late afternoon, Margaret felt both exhausted and strangely energized. She was married. She had legal protection for Lily. She had a partner in this fight instead of facing it alone. The fear that had been her constant companion for 2 years had finally begun to loosen its grip. On the wagon ride home, Lily chattered happily about having a papa, already claiming Caleb as fully as if he'd always been part of her life. Margaret listened with half an ear, her mind processing everything that had happened, everything that had changed. She was married to Caleb Stone. It was a fact that didn't quite feel real yet, though the ring on her finger was solid proof. They'd need to figure out so many things: sleeping arrangements, household routines, how to navigate the strange territory between legal partnership and actual intimacy. But they had time for that. Right now, the important thing was that they'd taken away Thornton's power over them. "What are you thinking?" Caleb asked quietly, his voice pitched below Lily's excited monologue. "That I'm grateful," Margaret answered honestly, "and terrified, and hopeful, all at once." "That seems about right," Caleb said. "I'm feeling similar things, but mostly I'm feeling ready. Ready to face Thornton when he comes back. Ready to fight for what's ours." "What's ours?" Margaret repeated, testing the words. "That still sounds strange." "It'll sound less strange the more we say it. Give it time." Caleb's hand found hers on the seat between them, threading their fingers together. "We're in this together now. Legally, officially, completely. That means something, Margaret. That means you're not alone anymore." The words unlocked something in Margaret's chest, some tight knot of fear and loneliness she'd been carrying so long she'd forgotten it was there. She wasn't alone. She had a partner, a husband, someone who'd chosen to stand beside her knowing full well the danger it invited. Maybe Fletcher was right. Maybe they could build something real from this practical foundation. Maybe respect and shared purpose could grow into something deeper, given time and patience and willingness. They arrived back at the ranch as sunset painted the sky in shades of orange and gold. Tom met them in the yard, his face breaking into a wide grin when Caleb explained what they'd done. "About damn time someone brought sense to this situation," Tom said, clapping Caleb on the shoulder. "Congratulations to you both. Lily, you got yourself a good papa. He'll take care of you right." "I know," Lily said confidently. "He's the best papa in the whole world." Caleb's expression softened at the child's absolute faith. He scooped Lily up, settling her on his hip with an ease that suggested he was already growing accustomed to fatherhood. "Let's get you inside, little one. It's been a long day." Margaret followed them into the house, their house now, legally and officially. She stood in the kitchen that had become her domain and felt the shift in everything. This wasn't just the place where she worked. This was her home. Caleb wasn't just her employer. He was her husband. They weren't just survivors sheltering together. They were a family, bound by law and choice and determination. That night, after Lily was tucked into bed, Margaret and Caleb stood in the hallway between their rooms, the awkwardness of their new situation suddenly overwhelming. "I'll take the spare room," Caleb said immediately. "You and Lily keep the one you've been using. We'll figure out better arrangements later, but for now—" "That's fine," Margaret said quickly, relief and something that might have been disappointment mixing in her chest. "We should probably talk, though, about expectations, about how we navigate this." They moved to the kitchen, sitting across from each other at the table where they'd shared so many meals. The lamp burned low between them, casting shadows that softened the harsh edges of reality. "I meant what I said earlier," Caleb began. "This marriage is real legally, but what it becomes personally is up to both of us. I won't pressure you for anything you're not ready to give. We're partners first. Everything else comes if and when it feels right." "Thank you for understanding that," Margaret said. "I need time to adjust to this. To being married again, to sharing a life with someone, to trusting that this is real and stable. Take all the time you need. We've got nothing but time." Caleb paused, then added, "But in public, we need to be convincing. Thornton or others will look for cracks they can exploit. So when we're in town, when people visit, we need to appear like what we are. A married couple building a life together." "I can do that," Margaret assured him. "I'm good at pretending when necessary." "Let's hope we won't have to pretend for long," Caleb said. "Let's hope this becomes real enough that there's no pretending involved." The comment hung in the air between them, full of possibility and uncertainty. Margaret wanted to ask what he meant, wanted to explore whether he felt any of the complicated attraction she was beginning to feel toward him. But it was too soon, too raw, too much for one day that had already held more change than most people experienced in years. "I should sleep," she said instead. "Tomorrow Thornton might return and I need to be ready." "We need to be ready," Caleb corrected. "We face him together, remember?" "Together," Margaret agreed, standing and moving toward her room. At the doorway, she paused and looked back. "Caleb? Thank you for everything, for giving us safety, for giving Lily a father, for giving me a chance to stop running." "Thank you for knocking on my door," Caleb replied softly. "For reminding me that life goes on even after loss. For bringing light back into this house." They held each other's gaze for a long moment, something unspoken passing between them. Then Margaret retreated to her room where Lily slept peacefully, secure in the knowledge that she finally had a family again. Margaret lay down beside her daughter and stared at the ceiling, processing the enormity of what they'd done. She was married, she had legal protection, she had a partner in the fight ahead. The ring on her finger felt both foreign and right, a physical symbol of promises made and future uncertainties. Tomorrow might bring Thornton and his threats, but tonight, in this house that had become home, with a child sleeping peacefully and a good man standing guard, Margaret allowed herself something she hadn't felt in 2 years. She allowed herself hope. Thornton returned exactly 4 days later, and this time he didn't come alone. Margaret was hanging laundry when she spotted the riders, 3 of them approaching in a tight formation that spoke of purpose and authority. Thornton rode in front, flanked by 2 men wearing deputy badges that glinted in the morning sun. Her heart seized, every instinct screaming to grab Lily and run, but she forced herself to stand firm. Running was what the old Margaret would have done. The new Margaret, Margaret Stone, wife and protected woman, would stand her ground. "Caleb!" she called, her voice carrying across the yard with remarkable steadiness. "We have visitors." He emerged from the barn within seconds, Tom and Miguel right behind him. The three men positioned themselves between the house and the approaching riders, a human wall of protection. Margaret saw Caleb's hand rest casually on his hip, close to where she knew he kept his pistol. The gesture was subtle, but unmistakable. Thornton dismounted with his characteristic grace, his expensive suit somehow still immaculate despite the dusty ride. The deputies stayed mounted, their faces professionally neutral, but their hands never far from their weapons. Margaret recognized the tactic, overwhelming force designed to intimidate before a word was even spoken. "Mr. Stone," Thornton said with false pleasantness. "Mrs. Hale, I've returned as promised, this time with proper legal authority," he gestured to the deputies. "These gentlemen are here to witness the transfer of custody of the minor child Lily Hale to her rightful guardians as specified in the agreements made by her late father." "There's been a development you should know about," Caleb said calmly. "Mrs. Hale is no longer Mrs. Hale. She's Mrs. Stone, my wife, which makes Lily my stepdaughter and under my legal protection as her father." The words landed like physical blows. Thornton's composed expression cracked for just a moment, revealing fury and calculation before he smoothed it back into professional courtesy. "Is that so? How convenient. And when did this marriage allegedly take place?" 4 days ago, legally performed and recorded by Augustus Fletcher, witnessed and notarized according to territorial law. Caleb pulled folded papers from his pocket. "Marriage certificate, right here, along with documentation of my petition to assume full parental rights and responsibilities for Lily Stone, formerly Lily Hale." One of the deputies leaned forward in his saddle. "You're saying the child's been legally adopted?" "I'm saying she has a new father, a stable home, and legal protection that supersedes any claims made against her deceased father's estate." Caleb's voice was steel wrapped in silk. "Whatever documents Mr. Thornton is carrying, they became irrelevant the moment Margaret and I married, and I claimed Lily as my daughter." Thornton's jaw tightened. "You can't simply marry your way out of legal obligations. The agreements Charles Hale made can only be enforced if there's a legitimate claim," Margaret interrupted, stepping forward to stand beside Caleb. "Which there isn't. Charles never signed over custody of our daughter. He couldn't have because he loved her and would have died before allowing her to be used as collateral. Whatever papers you have are forgeries, Mr. Thornton. We all know it, and if you force this to go before a judge, the whole world will know it too." "Those are serious accusations, Mrs. Stone." Thornton's use of her married name was sharp, mocking. "Accusing an officer of the court of forgery could have consequences." "So could attempting to kidnap a child under false pretenses," Caleb shot back. "Sheriff Morrison might be interested to hear about a Boston lawyer trying to remove a territorial citizen's daughter based on questionable documentation. The sheriff takes a dim view of outsiders causing trouble in his jurisdiction." The second deputy shifted uncomfortably. "Mr. Thornton, if there's a dispute about the legitimacy of these documents, maybe we should wait for—" "The documents are legitimate," Thornton insisted, but there was a thread of uncertainty in his voice now. "I have witnesses, signatures, proper legal—" "Then present them before a judge," Fletcher's voice cut through the tension. The lawyer had appeared from the direction of the road, riding a horse with surprising speed for a man his age. "Present them before Judge Hawthorne in territorial court. Let's examine these documents in proper legal proceedings where forgery can be properly assessed." Thornton's face darkened. "This is none of your concern, Fletcher." "On the contrary, it's entirely my concern. I represent Mr. and Mrs. Stone, and I won't allow you to intimidate my clients or attempt to remove a child from her legal guardians without proper judicial review." Fletcher dismounted and pulled his own sheaf of papers from his saddlebag. "I've done some investigating into your methods, Mr. Thornton. Seems you've pulled this scheme before, threatening legal action based on fabricated documents, relying on people being too poor or frightened to fight back. But the Stones aren't poor, and they're not frightened. They're prepared to fight this all the way to territorial Supreme Court if necessary." One of the deputies cleared his throat. "Mr. Thornton, if there's question about the document's validity, we can't proceed with removing the child. We'd need a court order from Judge Hawthorne, and he'd want to review everything first." "I have a court order," Thornton snapped, pulling an envelope from his coat. "Right here, signed by a federal magistrate in Boston. A federal magistrate has no jurisdiction over territorial custody matters, Fletcher said immediately. Any first-year law student knows that. Montana Territory governs its own domestic issues. You need a territorial judge's order, Mr. Thornton, and you don't have one. The deputies exchanged glances. The first one spoke carefully. Sir, if Mr. Fletcher's right about jurisdiction, we can enforce a federal order on territorial matters. We'd need to take this before Judge Hawthorne. Thornton's mask of civility was crumbling fast, revealing the calculating predator beneath. You're all making a serious mistake. My clients don't appreciate being denied what they're legally owed. There will be consequences for this obstruction. The only consequence will be the truth coming out, Margaret said, her voice ringing with newfound strength. The truth that you prey on desperate people, that you fabricate documents, that you use the appearance of legal authority to terrorize families. I'm done being afraid of you. I'm done running. You want Lily? You'll have to go through me, my husband, our lawyer, and every person in this territory who believes parents have the right to protect their children from criminals hiding behind law licenses. The words hung in the air like a battle cry. Margaret saw Thornton's eyes narrow, saw him calculate whether pushing this fight was worth the risk of exposure. She held her breath, waiting for his response, prepared for violence if it came. But it was Lily who broke the stalemate. The child emerged from where she'd been hiding behind Tom, her small face set with determination that echoed her mother's. She walked straight to Caleb and took his hand, looking up at Thornton with eyes that held no fear, only defiance. "This is my papa," she said clearly. "My real papa died, but now I have a new papa who loves me and keeps me safe. You can't take me away from my mama and papa. We're a family." The simple declaration, spoken with a child's absolute certainty, seemed to crystallize everything. Here was a girl who'd found safety and love. Here was a family that had chosen each other. Here was truth standing against corruption. Even the deputies seemed moved. The first one cleared his throat again. "Mr. Thornton, I think we need to head back to town and consult with Sheriff Morrison about proper procedures. The situation's more complicated than you indicated when you hired us." "I didn't hire you. I requisitioned your assistance under legal authority." "Which may not apply here," the deputy interrupted firmly. "We're not taking a child from her home without proper territorial authorization. That's final." Thornton's face had gone red with suppressed rage. "This isn't over. I'll be back with proper documentation, with a territorial judge's order, with whatever's necessary. You people think you've won, but you've only delayed the inevitable." "By all means, go to Judge Hawthorne," Fletcher said cheerfully. "Request a full hearing. Present your evidence. We'll present ours, including testimony about your pattern of fraud and intimidation. Let's see whose documentation holds up under judicial scrutiny." The threat was clear. If Thornton pushed this to court, his entire operation would be exposed. He could pursue this one case and risk destroying his ability to prey on future victims, or he could cut his losses and retreat. It was a calculated gamble, banking on Thornton's self-interest outweighing his commitment to his clients. For a long moment, Thornton stood frozen, clearly weighing his options. Then his expression shifted, became cold and closed. "My clients will be informed of this obstruction. Whatever consequences follow are on your heads." He swung back into his saddle with violent grace. "This territory is more backward and lawless than I was led to believe. No wonder you all hide out here in the wilderness. Civilized society would never tolerate such disregard for legal obligations." Or maybe civilized society is what you find when people care more about protecting children than collecting debts, Caleb said quietly. "You're welcome to test that theory in our courts, Thornton, but something tells me you won't be back." Thornton yanked his horse's reins and rode off without another word, the deputies following with obvious relief at escaping the situation. The 5 adults watched until the riders disappeared into the distance, nobody speaking until the hoofbeats faded completely. Then Margaret's legs gave out. She sank to her knees in the dusty yard, gasping for breath she couldn't seem to catch. The fear she'd held at bay through sheer will came flooding back, making her shake so violently she couldn't control it. Caleb was beside her instantly, his arms around her, his voice low and steady in her ear. "It's over. He's gone. You're safe." "He could come back," Margaret gasped. "He could bring a real judge, real documents." "He won't," Fletcher said with certainty. "I've seen men like Thornton before. They're predators who rely on fear and confusion. Once their prey shows teeth, once the fight becomes expensive and public, they move on to easier targets. He knows now that pursuing this case means exposing his methods. He can't risk that. But his clients, the men Charles owed money to, will cut their losses. $2,000 is substantial, but it's not worth the scrutiny this would bring. They operate in shadows. This fight would shine light into places they can't afford to have examined. Fletcher crouched down beside Margaret. You won, Mrs. Stone. You stood your ground, and you won. Margaret looked up at Lily, who was watching her mother with worried eyes. The child had been so brave, speaking up when it mattered most, claiming her family with a conviction that had turned the tide. Whatever else happened, Lily would remember this day. Remember that her mother had fought for her, that Caleb had stood as her father, that family meant people who protected each other against impossible odds. Come here, sweetheart, Margaret said, opening her arms. Lily rushed into them, and Margaret held her daughter tight, breathing in the scent of her hair, feeling the solid warmth of her small body. Real. Safe. Still hers. Tom cleared his throat gruffly. Well, that was more excitement than I've had in years. Miguel, let's get back to work before the horses think we've forgotten them entirely. Boss, you take care of your family. We'll handle the ranch for a while. After the two men left, Fletcher prepared to return to town. I'll file paperwork formally documenting the adoption and marriage. Make sure everything's properly recorded. If Thornton does somehow convince a territorial judge to hear his case, which I doubt, we'll be ready. But I truly believe you've seen the last of him. Thank you, Caleb said, shaking the older man's hand. For everything, for believing us, for fighting with us. That's what law should do, Fletcher replied. Protect the innocent, defend the powerless, stand between families and those who destroy them. Today it worked the way it's supposed to. That's worth more than any fee. He tipped his hat to Margaret. You've got a good man here, Mrs. Stone. And Mr. Stone, you've got a family worth fighting for. Take care of each other. After Fletcher rode away, the three of them stood in the yard, Caleb, Margaret, and Lily, connected by shared trauma and shared victory. The danger had passed, at least for now. The threat that had hung over them like a storm cloud had dissipated, leaving behind shaky relief and the beginning of genuine hope. I think, Caleb said slowly, we could all use something normal right now. Margaret, what do you say to making that bread Lily claims tastes like sunshine? I think we've earned something sweet. Margaret laughed, the sound surprising her with its genuine joy. I think that's the best idea I've heard in weeks. They went inside together, and Margaret set to work in the kitchen that had become her sanctuary. She mixed flour and water and yeast, her hands performing familiar motions that soothed her rattled nerves. Lily pulled a chair up to the counter to watch, asking her usual stream of questions. Caleb sat at the table with coffee, his presence solid and reassuring. This, Margaret thought as she kneaded dough, was what safety felt like. Not the absence of danger, but the presence of people who'd stand beside you when danger came. Not isolation and constant vigilance, but community and shared strength. As the bread baked, filling the house with warmth and the yeasty scent of rising dough, Margaret found herself really looking at her life for the first time in years. She had a home, a real home, not just a temporary shelter. She had a partner, a man who'd proven his worth in the most fundamental way by choosing to protect when protection came at personal cost. She had her daughter, safe and happy, and beginning to believe the world could be kind. It wasn't what she'd imagined when she'd knocked on Caleb Stone's door 8 weeks ago. It wasn't the life she'd planned when she married Charles or when she became a mother. But it was real, and it was hers, and it was worth every terrifying moment that had led to this kitchen, this day, this new beginning. Over the following weeks, life on Stone Creek Ranch settled into rhythms that felt less like performance and more like genuine existence. Margaret and Caleb navigated their unusual marriage with careful respect, maintaining separate bedrooms but sharing meals and decisions and the countless small intimacies of daily life. They learned each other's habits and preferences, discovered shared humor in unexpected places, built the foundation of partnership that Fletcher had suggested might grow into something more. Lily flourished. The child who'd been so careful, so guarded, began to open like a flower, finally getting enough sunlight. She laughed freely, ran through the ranch without looking over her shoulder, asked Tom endless questions about ranch life, and started calling Caleb Papa with unconscious ease. She began attending the small school in Stone Creek, making friends with other children, bringing home stories about spelling bees and playground games and all the normal concerns of childhood that she'd been denied during years of running. Margaret watched her daughter's transformation with gratitude so profound it sometimes brought her to tears. This was what she'd been fighting for, not just survival, but the chance for Lily to be a child, to have stability and security and the freedom to dream about the future instead of fear it. The women of Stone Creek, once they learned about the new marriage, welcomed Margaret with a warmth that surprised her. They brought gifts, jars of preserves, embroidered linens, recipes scribbled on scraps of paper. They included her in their sewing circles and church socials, treating her not as an outsider or a woman with a suspicious past, but as one of their own. Caleb's reputation protected her, yes, but it was Margaret herself who earned their respect through kindness and competence and genuine interest in their lives. News came through Tom one afternoon about 6 weeks after Thornton's departure. The ranch hand had been in town and heard gossip from the telegraph operator. That lawyer fellow, Thornton, he was arrested in Denver. Seems he tried his document scheme on the wrong family, someone with connections to the territorial governor. They investigated his past cases and found a pattern of fraud. He's facing criminal charges now. Margaret felt the last knot of fear finally unwind. Thornton couldn't hurt them anymore. He couldn't hurt anyone anymore. The monster that had chased them across half the country was caged. That night, after Lily was asleep, Margaret found Caleb on the porch, watching stars emerge in the darkening sky. She settled into the chair beside him, comfortable in the silence they'd learned to share. "Fletcher was right," she said finally. "We won." "We did," Caleb agreed. "You stood your ground when you could have run. That took courage." "I had help standing. I couldn't have done it alone." Margaret turned to look at him. This man who'd become her husband almost by accident, but who'd proven himself worthy of the title in every way that mattered. "Thank you, Caleb, for everything, for taking us in, for marrying me to keep Lily safe, for being the father she needed." "I should be thanking you," Caleb said quietly. "You brought my house back to life. You gave me reasons to care about tomorrow instead of just surviving today. You and Lily, you saved me, Margaret, more than you probably know." Something in his voice made Margaret's heart beat faster. They'd been dancing around this for weeks, this awareness of each other that went beyond practical partnership, the accidental touches that lingered a moment too long, the glances that carried weight beyond their apparent meaning, the growing sense that what they'd built together could become something more if they were brave enough to let it. "Caleb," Margaret said carefully, "when we married, you said we'd figure out the personal details as we went, that we'd take time to see what this could become beyond legal convenience." "I remember. I think," she paused, gathering courage, "I think I'm ready to figure some of those details out, if you are." Caleb was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was rough with emotion he wasn't quite managing to hide. "I loved Sarah. I'll always love her. That doesn't go away." "I know. I'm not asking you to forget her or replace what you had. But," Caleb continued, reaching over to take Margaret's hand, "I've learned these past months that the heart has more capacity than I thought, that you can love someone who's gone and still open yourself to loving someone who's here. You've become important to me, Margaret, not just as my wife on paper or as Lily's mother, but as you. I'd like to explore what that means, if you're willing." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. "I'm willing. I'm ready. It won't be perfect. We're both carrying too much history for perfect. But maybe we can build something real anyway. Something that honors where we've been while reaching toward where we want to go." "Something real," Caleb repeated, standing and pulling her up to face him. "I like the sound of that." He kissed her then, not the perfunctory kiss of their wedding ceremony, but something genuine and full of possibility. Margaret kissed him back, tasting hope and promise and the beginning of something that might actually be love, given time and patience and willingness to try. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing harder than warranted by the simple kiss, Caleb rested his forehead against hers. "We should probably take this slow. Figure things out properly." "Probably," Margaret agreed, though neither of them moved apart. Give Lily time to adjust to us being more than just convenient partners. That's wise. Maybe move your things into my room, our room, gradually so it doesn't feel rushed. Very sensible. They stood there under the emerging stars, holding each other and grinning like fools, both recognizing the absurdity of trying to be sensible about feelings that were already well beyond sensible. Or, Caleb said, we could acknowledge that we're both adults who've earned the right to make our own choices about our own lives. And we could just decide to build this marriage into something real because we want to, not because anyone's forcing us. I like that option better, Margaret admitted. So they did. They took the marriage that had begun as a legal convenience and transformed it into a genuine partnership. Margaret moved into Caleb's room and they learned to share space and intimacy and the 1,000 small negotiations of actual matrimony. They fumbled and laughed and occasionally frustrated each other, but they kept trying, kept building, kept choosing each other every day. Lily adjusted with the resilient adaptability of children. She was delighted to have parents who clearly cared for each other, who laughed together over breakfast and held hands while walking to town, and sometimes danced in the kitchen when they thought no one was watching. She stopped having nightmares about men coming to take her away. She started planning what she wanted to be when she grew up. She became, simply and wonderfully, a child allowed to be a child. The seasons turned. Autumn gave way to the brutal Montana winter Caleb had warned them about, and then winter softened into spring. The ranch thrived under their combined efforts, Caleb's expertise, Margaret's management, even Lily's small contributions of gathering eggs and feeding chickens and bringing joy to mundane tasks. News came occasionally from the wider world. Charles's creditors had indeed abandoned their pursuit once Thornton's arrest made clear that continuing would bring unwanted attention. The debt died with Charles, as it legally should have from the beginning. Margaret was free, truly free, for the first time in 3 years. On a warm afternoon in late May, nearly a year after Margaret had first knocked on Caleb's door, the three of them sat on the porch watching storm clouds build over the mountains. Lily was teaching herself to braid rope under Tom's patient instruction, her small fingers struggling with the complex pattern, but her determination absolute. She looks like you when she gets that determined expression, Caleb observed, nudging Margaret with his shoulder. She's stubborn like her father, Margaret countered. Both of them, actually, the one who gave her life and the one who chose to raise her. They'd learned to speak of Charles without bitterness, acknowledging his role in Lily's existence while not excusing the choices that had endangered his family. It was a delicate balance, but one they'd managed to find. Have I told you today that I love you? Caleb asked suddenly. Margaret turned to him, still startled by casual declarations of affection after so many years without them. I don't think you have. Well, I do love you, both of you, this life we've built together. He gestured at the ranch, the mountains, the sky, preparing to storm. All of it. I love you too, Margaret said softly. I didn't think I'd ever say those words again and mean them, but I do. I love our complicated, imperfect, absolutely real life. Lily looked up from her rope braiding, her face split by a grin. Are you two being mushy again? Tom says you're always being mushy. Tom should mind his own business, Caleb called toward the barn, where the old ranch hand was undoubtedly listening. Can't mind my business when you do your mushiness right out in public, Tom shouted back, his laughter carrying across the yard. Margaret laughed, the sound free and genuine. This was her life now, this ranch, this family, this community of people who'd claimed her, and whom she'd claimed in return. Not the life she'd planned or expected, but infinitely better than anything she could have imagined that desperate day when she'd arrived at Caleb Stone's door with nothing but an iron pot and hope. The storm broke with dramatic suddenness, rain sweeping across the ranch in sheets. They scrambled inside, laughing and dripping, Lily shrieking with delight at the adventure of it all. Margaret busied herself stoking the fire and preparing hot drinks while Caleb and Lily toweled off, their voices mixing with the drum of rain on the roof. Later, after dinner, after Lily was tucked into bed with stories and kisses, after the storm had passed and left the world smelling of wet earth and possibility, Margaret and Caleb stood at their bedroom window, watching moonlight break through departing clouds. Do you ever regret it? Margaret asked, opening your door that night, saying yes to all this complication? Caleb pulled her close, his arms secure around her waist. Not for a single moment. Best decision I ever made, letting you and Lily into my life. You taught me something important. What's that? That family isn't just about blood or law or even love, though those things matter. Family is about choosing to stand together when the world tries to tear you apart. It's about protection and partnership and building something worth defending. He kissed her temple. You knocked on my door offering to cook. What you really offered was a reason to start living again. I'll be grateful for that until the day I die. Margaret turned in his arms, reaching up to cup his face. We saved each other, I think. You gave us safety when we needed it most. We gave you purpose when you'd forgotten why life mattered. We all got exactly what we needed, even if we didn't know it at the time. Fate, maybe, Caleb suggested, or luck, or just the universe deciding we'd suffered enough and deserved something good. Whatever it was, I'm grateful. Margaret kissed him softly. I'm home, Caleb. After 3 years of running, of being afraid, of never knowing if tomorrow would bring disaster. I'm finally home. You are, he agreed. We all are. This is our home, our family, our life. And nobody, not Thornton, not creditors, not the past, can take that away from us. We fought for it. We earned it. It's ours. They stood together in the moonlight, husband and wife, not by accident or convenience, but by choice and commitment and hard-won love. Outside, the ranch settled into quiet night sounds, cattle lowing, horses shifting in their stalls, the wind singing through pine trees on the mountainside. Inside, 3 people who'd found each other against impossible odds slept secure in the knowledge that they belonged to each other, protected by bonds stronger than blood and deeper than law. The woman who'd knocked on a widowed cowboy's door offering her skills as a cook had become the heart of his home. The child who'd hidden behind her mother's skirts had become a daughter with 2 fathers, one who'd given her life, one who'd chosen to give her everything else. The man who'd been slowly dying of grief had rediscovered reasons to live, found in the laughter of a child and the love of a woman brave enough to believe in second chances. Stone Creek Ranch had become more than a place. It had become a testament to the power of choosing family, of standing together against darkness, of believing that broken people could build something whole if they were willing to try. The knock that had started everything had led to this, to peace, to belonging, to love that was real precisely because it had been tested and had survived. Margaret Hale had arrived seeking employment. Margaret Stone had found home. And in finding home, all 3 of them had finally, completely, been saved. The end came not with dramatic flourish, but with the quiet certainty of sunrise after a long night. They had weathered the storm. They had protected what mattered. They had built a family that would last not because it was perfect, but because it was real and chosen and defended with everything they had. That was enough, more than enough. It was everything,